Good morning, everyone. We're about to start, so if I can invite you to your seats, will be much more appreciated. Thank you so much. So today is the second day of the research forum. Yesterday, we had our yearly AASB annual research forum where we had lots of discussions with diverse topics, and we have various stakeholders coming together with great conversations and networking. And thank you for those who were here yesterday and back here today again, and welcome those who are here the first time attending the second day research forum. So the objective for the research forum is for us to gather together to share ideas, have conversations. It is not a typical research forum. It is a forum where it's a safe place for us to just share your experience and your insights to us. So with that, I just want to mention that the speakers and presenters here during the day, the views are not necessarily the entities that they represent, unless they specify as such. A few housekeeping matters. Follow the direction of the Sofitel staff in the event of an emergency. If you hear the beep sound, you stay still, don't go anywhere until you get further instructions. If you hear the whoop sound, that's when we all need to start panicking a little bit. We have to start preparing ourselves, moving out from this room. The emergency door just right there at the back. The good news is there's lots of space for us to move quickly if we needed to. Outside the Fitzroy ballroom and proceed to the right is the bathrooms. And all the morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea will be served in the pre-function area outside this room. Now, you may have noticed the agenda this morning. We have a very packed agenda that you don't actually get a morning tea break. However, we encourage you to bring tea or food now if you want to. They're still available outside for you to enjoy the sessions throughout this morning. The post-meeting networking drinks will take place in the West House suite on level 35. By the end of the day, we will take you to our networking function, which is on level 35. Up on the screen, you'll see there's a Wi-Fi which you can use. The password is on the screen. And I also want to remind you to turn your mobile to silent mode, but do not turn it off, because during the sessions, we encourage you to ask questions and provide your views by using the QR code. The QR code will take you to a platform where you can ask questions. And if time allows, we will try to answer your questions during the day. So that's pretty much it's a housekeeping, and now we'd like to invite our chair, AASB Chair, Dr. Keith Kendall, to give an opening remarks. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Eric. Can't have him not seeing where he's going. Just echoing some of Eric's comments there, it is very pleasing to see so many faces that we saw yesterday. This being one of our first sustainability-focused research forums, so it's excellent to see just how much support that this is generating amongst our stakeholder community. So from me, very, very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for showing your support in this fashion, and welcome to everyone that's following the session online. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, from the 1st of January this year, we entered the brave new world of mandatory climate reporting in Australia, aligned with the AASB's S1 and S2. Now, this is set in place a trend, at least regionally, that has been pushing through. So since Australia made the decision to align with the AASB, we've seen similar decisions undertaken by Singapore, Japan, Indonesia and Malaysia. So it's very pleasing to see how much support that this position has received from the region as well. Consistent with the AASB's tradition in how we approach financial reporting standards, We're taking the same approach in developing sustainability reporting standards, and in particular of relevance for today, that involves very, very much a heavy emphasis on evidence-informed standard setting. And particularly for the academics in the audience, that's where you guys come in. And so this is where events like this really come to the fore, where we actually get the evidence that drives the development of, well, in this case, sustainability reporting standards. So I won't go through, I know sessions during today are going to be going through research opportunities for where future projects can be undertaken. But I do encourage those of you that are active in the research space to be actively thinking about what you can do, what projects you can undertake, what sort of work would be of interest to the AASB in this very new area. And so on that note, I'd like to hand over to Sabine Schruer to start the day's proceedings. Thank you very much.
Welcome everybody again, and thank you, Keith. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Mathieu today for our first keynote. Dr. Mathieu is a research scientist at CSIRO and co-leads the CSIRO's Future Climate and Hazard activity within the Australian Climate Service section. Richard's interests involve exploring the role of the oceans and what role they play in the global climate and carbon systems. He's currently investigating the predictability of the climate system and trying to demonstrate the utility of climate forecasts at the multi-year timescale. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Mathieu.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to be here. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rich Mathieu. I'm a climate scientist based at CSIRO. I've been very involved with something called the Australian Climate Service, and I'm going to present today a little bit of work around some work that's just come out. So maybe just quickly move to the next slide. Really going to talk a bit about this National Climate Risk Assessment, and it was done for the Commonwealth Government. And I'm going to tell you a little bit what it is, what we did, and some of the key messages that emerged from it. Following on from that, I'll talk a bit about future climate and some of the new products we're generating that I think will underpin, hopefully, further work in sort of the climate risk space that maybe the people in this room will take on board. And then I'll kind of end the talk with a few key messages that have emerged from the climate risk assessment that's come out recently. I guess I just want to start with first saying, yeah, the climate's changing. I feel like we've moved on from this idea that we're debating whether the climate's changing. There's clear evidence that it is changing and it's impacting our lives. And that emerges quite nicely in the climate risk assessment, and it'll emerge quite nicely in some of the data sets I will present later on. I guess I just want to first start by saying, what is the Australian Climate Service? It's sort of this virtual entity that brings together some of the key players in this space. So it involves the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO, Australian Bureau of Statistics, and Geosciences Australia. And really the idea was to kind of set up this agency to really tackle issues around climate and climate risk and climate impact. And so with that, one of our first key kind of outcomes of this effort has been this National Climate Risk Assessment that was released about a month ago. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And really the focus really is on this idea of making Australia more resilient and more prosperous in a future climate change world. So just to kind of start it off, for the risk assessment, we focused a lot on this kind of intersection of the hazard. So that's kind of where my expertise comes in, looking at what's exposed, what's vulnerable, and then kind of using that to get the risk. But we also want to bring this idea that we're going to respond to climate risk, and that will then have an impact back on this loop in terms of, you know, we can respond in ways that can make the system more maladaptive and actually further increase the risk going forward. So that's kind of a broad outline. That's really was set up by this IPCC effort during the last assessment report that was produced in 2022. And that kind of sets the stage for how we're going to tackle this problem. In today's presentation, I'll focus a lot on the hazard because I really think this risk bit that involves the vulnerability, exposure, and response really requires the expertise in this room to really translate that into a company or into another entity's kind of risk profile. And you need that sort of domain knowledge to really tackle that problem. And so essentially, just stepping back to the risk assessment, there's kind of two key things that emerged from that. So essentially, to do the risk assessment, we first started by defining a bunch of priority hazards. So you can read that there. There are things like changes in temperature, drought, bushfires, tropical storms, convective storms. And so from that list, and that list was really formed around what hazards have the biggest impact on the economic or social fabric of our country. And that was framed around things like heat has a big impact on mortality, just like floods. They can have a big impact on, if you look at hail, for example, big impact on insurance loss in Australia. And that's sort of the hazard side of things. And then to do the risk assessment, we focused on a bunch of key functional systems. And you can read the list there, but it involves things like the communities, the economy, the health and social services. And for this risk assessment, we focused, as you can see, on the physical risk. Okay, we didn't bring in the transitional risk in this first phase. This is the first time that Australia has done this. It had a framing around the Commonwealth and what its risks are. So that's really important as well. It wasn't trying to do a local government or an industry. It really was with the lens of the Commonwealth. So some of those things are like, if I go down to here, natural environment, Commonwealth has a big role to play in kind of sustaining and maintaining our key ecological assets, and that's a key point of the risk assessment. So that kind of sets the stage. So really, we're trying to merge these two things. And to do that, we brought in a bunch of different priority risks. So this is identified in the first phase of the risk assessment. These are sort of the key priority areas that we want to focus on. And then for the risk assessment, we brought in expertise in each one of these areas. And I'm just going to flag my institute, CSRO. CSRO contribute to 6 of these different priority risks. And this, again, brought in our domain experts and things like critical infrastructure to really look at how climate change intersects with critical infrastructure. So things like exposure of critical infrastructure to things like flooding or storms were a big part of that story. And I guess the thing I want to emphasize from the risk assessment, besides a focus on the Commonwealth, is this idea to kind of mainstream climate risk assessments. Okay, so going forward, it should be part of risk assessments rather than this special thing that's just a climate perspective. Because as we move into these systems, you see there's lots of interactions going on. If I pick, for example, supply chains there, that has a big impact. If you lose certain critical transport roads, that can have a massive impact on lots of things that actually cascade down. You can't get the food or the water to a community, and forget about even the economic consequences of it. That can have big impacts on a community's sustainability. So that's the broad background of the climate risk assessment. I'd like to now move on and we'll talk a little bit about our approach and some of the products that have emerged from our effort in the Australian Climate Service. So just kind of stepping back a little bit, you may have come across these words, so typically when we do the IPC assessment reports every 5 years, we talk a little bit about scenarios. So in the last report, the key thing was SSPs, shared socioeconomic pathways. And that's a framing to kind of look at how CO2 emissions change with time going forward. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to this plot is, for the first time, I feel like I can actually say the high scenario that was put forward in this sixth assessment report actually is well above kind of where we're tracking. So for the first time, I can feel like we're actually making a difference. We're actually implementing strategies to reduce our CO2 emissions, and we're no longer following the worst case scenario. And it turns out we're actually even below the second one here, this SSP 370, and that's a pretty positive message. The other thing I want to take away from this plot that's important and relevant to this group is if you look at this 1.5 degree of global warming scenario here, this is sort of the Paris best attempt, you'll see something happens here on CO2 emissions. So basically, by the second half of the century, this line goes negative. What does that mean? That means net CO2 emissions have to go negative. We actually have to take carbon out of the system, not just reduce it, but take it out. So that's an important message I have, is to actually get to 1.5 really requires active management of the carbon system in a way that actually takes CO2 out of the system. Okay, so that's the SSP framing. One of the things we did differently in the risk assessment is we decided not to talk about scenarios like this. We decided that made more sense and more relevant to the people in this audience is to use something called global warming levels. And the reason why I like this approach is, one, it allows us to kind of condense down that complex SSP scenario space into global warming levels, which are relevant to policy decisions. It turns out for most hazards, whether it's a storm or a flood or a rain, that actually it responds very rapidly to CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And there's a nice relationship between rising temperatures and what that hazard might do. So it is a good framing for looking at climate hazards and simplifies the system. And also very policy relevant. So for the risk assessment, we looked at kind of four different global warming levels. So roughly the value for today is about 1.2 degrees. We look at a scenario for 1.5, 2, and 3 to kind of help put some time limits on that. We looked at a scenario of 1.5 by 2050 or a 2-degree scenario by 2050. And then we did a second kind of assessment of 2 and 3 degrees of global warming to a 2090. Just to kind of give people a perspective on how the system is changing and where we're going. And just, again, as you note, 1.2, we're pretty close to the 1.5 target of the Paris Accord. These bounds kind of show you when they happen in those different simulations that I showed in the previous slide. So depending on the scenario, you can get to 2 degrees very fast, or you can get to 2 degrees very low. Some of that is uncertainty in the climate models. Some of that is uncertainty in the scenarios. But that gives you a perspective. I think this is a nice framing to kind of allow us to look at climate risk and make a link back to policy. Okay, so maybe I just quickly go through this slide just to remind people that, in this climate space, there is uncertainties. Some of that uncertainty stems from the model. Some of that uncertainty stems from our understanding of the observations, the experiments, the theory, and the models. I guess if I just take you through this slide here, for example, statement of fact, the climate has warmed since pre-industrial times. That is true. That's true for Australia. That's true for the world. Future increases in sea level rise, heat extremes, and sea level extremes, almost guaranteed. Okay. The only question is, we know what the sign is. It's increasing. What we don't know is how much it might increase by. And as you go down this list, it becomes a little bit more uncertain. Again, if you take a risk framing, even if something's really uncertain, like changes in large hail, it still might be really relevant to a business or an entity because it has a big impact. So it's a question of kind of your risk tolerance as well as the uncertainty when you're doing a risk assessment. Maybe just to remind people that the way we've tackled this problem in Australia is we start with these global models. We do something that's shown in this panel here. We actually then run a high resolution version, say, for example, for Australia, which is we did for the risk assessment. That provides much more detailed information. That's really important because to characterize the 10 key hazards, we really need the high resolution information because we're kind of moving now from climate to weather. And it's kind of an interesting debate. We've talked about what is climate, what is weather. Well, actually, I feel like the two are merging again because what's the biggest impact of climate change? How does it change the weather? How does it change that tropical cyclone? How does it change extreme rainfall? So that's forcing us to kind of do something very similar to what's happening in the weather space, go much higher resolution. And I just put this third one down to note that there actually are additional simulations out there in the Australian domain that go to even higher res. And the reason for doing that is, again, things like a hailstorm or a convective storm requires much higher resolution than we're even doing at this sort of national scale. For the risk assessment, we focus on the national scale, though. All right, I'm going to just take you quickly through a couple examples to kind of give you a flavor for what some of the products might look like. Okay, so this is one, for example, change in temperature and extremes. So this bottom panel shows you a plot that's included in the State of the Climate most recent report, showing you in red the sea surface temperature, and in blue the sea surface temperature, red the air temperature above Australia. And again, this is clear evidence from the start of the 1900s. We've had actually an increase in temperature both in the oceans around Australia as well as on the continent. That increase is almost 1.5 degrees for Australia in terms of the continental average. A little bit less if we look at the ocean, maybe more like 1 degree. And how does that then play out in terms of how we look at extreme heat waves? And what this panel is showing you here is the current state at 1.2 degrees of global warming. And again, most of the heat waves generally happen in the northern part of the country. As we go forward under higher levels, we see by 3 degrees of global warming, we have a dramatic increase in the number of heat waves, particularly in northern Australia. This is an example where have a big impact on things like people's ability to work outside and do high intensity effort outside in an environment where we're much more exposed to heat waves. So just to kind of give you an idea, by a 3 degree global warming level, we're looking at about an increase of 16-ish days in terms of heat waves per year. So that's a pretty massive increase if you think of heat waves in the space. I'll just show another one. This is an attempt to try to characterize how sea level rise is impacting Australia. This plot shows you something called the change in the frequency extreme water level. So this water level kind of characterizes things like rising sea level is an important component of that, but actually rising sea level is associated with waves and tides, and that combines to change the extreme water levels. And this kind of is a proxy for inundation in the coastal environment. It also gives you an idea of maybe coastal erosion as well. And the message that I want to leave you here is this multiplication factor is kind of giving you an idea of if you have a rare event, say a 1 in 100 year event in the current climate, by a 1.2 degrees of global warming, it might increase by a factor of 2. And if we get down to a sea level rise of about 1 meter by the end of the century, that factor is more like 100. So we're actually moving from a 1 in 100 year event happening once every 100 years to something that maybe happens every year. And that just gives you a flavor for how dramatic that change in extreme water levels will change as sea level rises into the future. So that's kind of 2 quick examples. I guess I just want to put the slide up. You're welcome to take the slides after the presentation, just to kind of identify all the different new products that are available. They haven't been released yet on the ACS website, but that'll be done by the end of the month. And I'm hoping that this will be a product that people in this room can use to basically do their own risk assessments going forward. I guess I just want to emphasize before I move on from the hazards is I focus in the current risk assessment, we focus a lot on individual hazards. And I just want to emphasize that generally they don't happen independently. So for example, I might think of a heat event might be associated originally with the dry conditions and a drought. Then we have a hot day, which may then also lead to a bushfire event. So these kind of 3 hazards are happening in tandem. Similar kind of idea might apply to a tropical storm hitting the coast of Australia, where we have rising sea levels impacting coastal erosion. Associated with the tropical cyclone is extreme winds as well as extreme rainfall, giving rise to flooding on the land and flooding along the coast as well. So those are kind of things going forward. Similarly, in the climate space, I'm going to call these things known unknowns. For example, if I look, for example, at ice sheet melt is going to raise sea level. You know, if you look at the IPCC report, we have something called committed sea level rise by under sort of 1.5 degrees of global warming. The committed sea level rise has been estimated to be maybe 1 to 3 meters due to ice sheet melt that will continue well after we stabilize CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And that's just emphasizing kind of the long tail of ice sheets and the ocean circulation that gives rise to this term. The thing with sea level rise with ice sheets is we don't really have a great understanding how fast that might happen. So an example where ice sheets might melt much more quickly than we anticipated, and that would have a massive impact on the coastal environment around Australia. So it's an example of, we know it's highly likely to happen, we just don't know how fast it might happen. And then again, from a risk perspective, that might be an important thing to consider as you go forward. And again, it depends a little bit on your risk tolerance. Obviously, building critical infrastructure along the coast, you might take a different perspective to how you design that in a future world than other infrastructure where you can tolerate occasional flooding. Okay, so now I'd like to just quickly comment on some of the key findings of the risk assessment. And this is kind of the key messages we have, you know, things like extreme weather and compound hazards are becoming more common, and that will continue in the future. These compound hazards actually have also much more complicated responses on the society and the economy. So I think of things like bushfires, it might take us decades to recover from a bushfire because it takes time to rebuild the community. And given, you know, things like the housing crisis now, again, trying to rebuild communities after they've been destroyed is a long haul process. I think this rising sea level definitely exposes coastal communities to this hazard. And again, with some uncertainty in terms of how fast sea level rise might go in the future. Again, that's an important thing as we think of these communities. Remote and regional communities appear to be much more vulnerable to climate change because of a whole bunch of factors, like they don't have as much economic clout. They're much more tied to individual industries. That's an important thing to consider. Extreme heat, is an emerging important feature. As I mentioned earlier, big impact on labor productivity working in an outside environment. So that could be something to really think seriously about going forward in the future. We already have places in the US, for example, where people wear ice jackets to tolerate working outside in an environment that's much hotter. For the risk assessment, lots of focus on the natural environment. Definitely things like the coral reef, Great Barrier Reef is extremely vulnerable to future climate change, and it's not looking good. And we need to think a bit about how we might actually tackle reducing the CO2 emissions, as I mentioned earlier on about actually taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There's some concern that economic systems, as we get exposed to more climate-related pressures, that might also impact our ability to actually manage the system and actually convince people that we're making choices that are important. And I just move to the last slide, and just kind of the key message we have here is, for example, we did an assessment of what the current risk is. And I guess my key message from these 8 different systems is the current risk is there already. So we're not talking about something over the horizon. It actually is from these systems. People have assessed it as either moderate or in some cases even high. And as we go forward under global warming, this shows you what the assessment is for 2 degrees of global warming by 2050, and they all get much worse. So that's a really important message that we're actually, for example, if I look at the natural environment, we're rapidly moving to an environment where it's a much more impactful as climate change goes forward in time. And so with that, I'd just like to flag there's lots of really good, useful information on the Australian Climate Service website, bunch of reports there that kind of characterize the national risk assessment, both from overviews as well as much more detailed papers talking about the hazard and the climate, or focusing on the different risk systems that were looked at in the assessment. So with that, I'm happy to take a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that very interesting, insightful presentation. I'm sure that's giving us a lot to take away and to think about. I might start off with the first question, Richard. One of your slides mentioned a 1.5 increase of the land temperature since 1910, and the Corporations Act requires that companies provide a scenario analysis on 1.5 global warming. So do you think that this is still a feasible scenario?
So first, a step back. So you're right. The scenarios are based on global warming levels of 1.5 degrees. That's global, though. Okay, so the numbers I showed in that plot are actually the average air temperature above Australia, which is actually hotter than the global average. And that just think from a physical standpoint, the land warms up faster than the oceans, and that's why the land is warming up faster than the global average, and that's why it's not quite. So we still haven't reached 1.5 degrees of global warming. We're at about 1.2, but we're rapidly approaching it. So I'd say in the next decade, we'll definitely get there. Probably it's a kind of calculation that's hard to know until we actually pass it, because it's based on sort of a 20-year average is the way I'd frame it. So, but we're rapidly approaching that, but we haven't quite hit that yet, even though Australia is 1.5 degrees warmer. So it'll be 2 degrees probably by the time I get to 1.5. Thanks.
Thank you. Another question that we've had also refers to one of the slides that you showed earlier in your presentation, which was about the 10 priority hazards.
Yep.
And I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit on how these 10 priority hazards were determined.
So the key data sets that went into that are things like the insurance industry assessing the hazards in terms of their financial cost, additional studies that looked at the mortality/health implications of the hazards. And then the third one was a little bit from a social economic perspective on terms of communities and what impacts them. So bushfires, for example, might be. So that was kind of where that original list of 10 came from. Probably the one that didn't talk so much, it was just off the screen, was the impact of ocean warming and acidification. Again, that's a kind of a big impact, big hazard for things like the natural environment, especially things like the Great Barrier Reef. So that was kind of the framing for that.
Thank you. And the last questions, maybe before we can have some audience questions, is you mentioned that the National Climate Risk Framework was developed for the Commonwealth level. And I was wondering whether you could give us some insights or pointers as to how other entities across the public and the private sector might make use of that framework.
So I really feel like, yeah, I emphasized the word framework. So I think things like, I'm quite keen that people think about the global warming levels as a way to reframe the risk. I think it's very relevant to the policies. And second, the data sets that underpin the risk assessment, I'm saying by the end of the month, they should be released. I'm very keen that people start to use them. So we actually have a consistent set of hazards that characterize that. And then third, I think a lot of work that's been done in terms of looking at the risk systems also is relevant to this group in terms of kind of giving some guidance about how people have tried to translate the climate and hazard information into an impact on a particular system. So I think those three are kind of three clear examples where I think it provides kind of a flag in the ground to kind of characterize how to do a risk assessment. It emphasizes the mainstreaming of it. It also it was our first one for Australia. I would hope we repeat that in 5 years' time. So another bit of that work is getting information that actually allows us to kind of characterize, are we making a difference? So there's a part around the monitoring evaluation piece as well that's kind of embedded in some of the information that's in that risk assessment.
And you also mentioned that there was a focus on the physical risks at this point in time, right? So do you anticipate that the transition risks will feature in any future?
I hope so. Yes, I hope so. So my background, the reason why I mentioned the oceans at the very beginning is it plays a massive role in the carbon story. And so, for example, for people to know, all the carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere, 80% will reside in the ocean. It'll take 2,000 years for that to happen. So actually, global warming will go away. Unfortunately, that'll take 2,000 years. And in the meantime, we'll have massive changes in the climate system. And that's really important. And the second message I have would be, things like the Great Barrier Reef, to solve that problem really requires really advancing technology to remove carbon dioxide from the system, from the atmosphere. And that's, again, part of where my research is going personally. So, yeah.
All right. So we've got a few audience questions. So the first one is, what are the most significant compounding hazards currently affecting Australia, and how are they expected to evolve under the higher global warming levels?
Well, I'm really interested in this kind of tropical cyclone, sea level rise. I think that's an obvious one. And that maybe I'd broaden that out from tropical cyclone. It could just be a storm. So an East Coast low is a common storm that hits the southern part of the country. Yeah, that kind of interaction of the storm, the rainfall, and the winds that go with that, and rising sea level rise, and the waves and storm and waves that go with that. So essentially that kind of compound hazard really can have an impact on coastal communities. It turns out also if you raise the water offshore, that can have an impact on how that flood water flows back into the ocean. So I think that's an obvious one that's really impactful. And for example, we're working on a case study that's looking at trying to build a narrative around how that impacts the system, and actually bringing in people that are looking more at the impact side of things to kind of help kind of characterize that in the current climate, and then actually look at, let's go forward 20 years and look at how rising sea level of another 0.5 meter might impact that kind of scenario and expose other risks to that system. Thanks.
Thank you. Another question is, how did you select which climate models and underlying data sets to be used in the assessments?
So there's a couple of papers that talk a bit about the actual global climate models we chose. And generally they were driven by models that do a reasonable job in the Australian domain. So that was sort of the first criteria that we used. And then to do this work, we also used multiple regional climate models. So in this case, the Australian Climate Service considered a model that the Bureau's developed and a model that CSIRO's developed. And that was an attempt to kind of do a better job of spanning the space in terms of what the possible scenarios might be. And that's okay. So that's kind of the broad background for the national risk assessment. That work is continuing being refined. So one of the big changes that have happened in sort of the global climate modeling community is they've recognized the uncertainty in the climate system, and they're running what I'm calling large ensembles, where they don't just run the climate model forward in a scenario, they actually run 40 of those versions that actually do a better job of characterizing the climate. And some of the new things that we're working on is actually how to utilize those large ensembles to do a better job of characterizing the system. And that's really relevant to things like, I didn't talk so much about rainfall in Southern Australia, but that's a very uncertain quantity at the moment in these climate models and very uncertain quantity in the regional models. So it's really hard for me to get up here and say a lot about, is Southeast Australia going to dry out with climate change? It's not so clear, at least from the modeling world. Thanks.
Yes, and I guess a closely related question then, depending on which models you use and which databases you use and how you interpret is then the outcome of the scenarios, right? So the next question was, there seems to be a general trend, especially for government and large entities to use the SSP 5 to 8.5 as the more extreme scenarios. In light of your comments this morning about +4, +5 degrees Celsius likelihood, would CSIRO recommend entities use the SSP 7.0 as a better extreme than 8.5?
Yes. But I'd also
So
favor
very clear.
I'd also favor the global warming approach rather than the actual SSP. And it also does a better job of kind of capturing the uncertainty in the climate projections, because you kind of normalize everything to a global warming level. And the big difference between the models are they're all warming up, some warm up faster than others. So using the global warming level helps kind of reduce that spread.
Yeah.
So you can move away from that high scenario. I feel like we're on something less. Maybe it's still not going to be less than 3.7, but yes, that's an important message.
Thank you, Richard. Now we've got a question from someone from overseas, from the Philippines. We've been experiencing here in the Philippines onslaught of those brought by climate changes. What would you recommend for the Philippines to implement to avoid these kinds of devastations?
Oh, well, the Philippines is
Tough one.
definitely hammered by tropical cyclones. And okay, if I first relate it back to the Australian environment, I'd go, one of the things we struggle with tropical cyclones in the current simulations is whether they're going to move poleward with climate change. That's a big uncertainty. I'd say not clear. So I would say not robust result. But I think things like the warming of the atmosphere does mean you're probably going to put more moisture into the atmosphere, and extreme rainfall associated with a tropical cyclone. So this is relevant to the Philippines, is probably going to be more common. And so that's a big issue when you're basically going to amp up the likelihood of flooding associated with these extreme tropical cyclones. So I'd be concerned, that you actually take a better approach to actually how you deal with flooding, both from the inland flooding as well as along the coast where you have rising sea levels and that storm generated waves. So those are two places where I think, you should be thinking about reducing your risk.
And I guess that is one of the issues with climate change, is that it doesn't take country borders as a succinct line, right? A question that we also often hear at the AASB is we hear a lot about risk and compliance. We hear less about opportunities. Do you have any thoughts on opportunities that arise from climate change?
I live in Tasmania. Come on down. It's probably not very impacted by climate change compared to some other communities. That being facetious, but again, so that's one. There are places that are going to be less riskful than others. That might open up new opportunities, both business-wise and community-wise. I think I'm quite a big champion of this idea around carbon dioxide removal. I think there's an opportunity there. So Australia, for example, if you look at our emission strategy, we're anticipating we can rely a lot on the land to take up carbon dioxide. I think that's optimistic, and I think considering other ways to do that. And I think as we move to a renewable energy-driven economy, I think the access to energy, particularly during the day when we're producing lots of solar energy, opens up new opportunities to kind of use that excess power for other things. And I think carbon dioxide removal is one concept where direct air capture is a very energy-intensive process. We have lots of land. We have good experience in the geology of our environment. So actually taking that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and injecting it into a geological aquifer is a possibility as an opportunity going forward.
Okay, and one last audience question. Since we have a lot of academics in the room, and this is a research forum. How do you think the research community can best work together across disciplines to incentivize organizations to build climate risk effectively into their business models?
Well, I'll kind of deviate a little bit. So I've been working a bit with people like Treasury around trying to relate the hazards we produce into economic consequences. And I feel like that space, from a research side, they're using quite simplistic models to do that translation. And I think there's lots of scope to rethink that. So some of the damage functions, I'm going to call them, are pretty idealistic. And I feel like could be a place where the people in this room could really work with people like my team to kind of look at how we might do that problem better. So I think I've presented in that table of a bunch of products that the group has produced around climate hazards, but I might go, there's lots of different ways to kind of reframe that. So I'm quite keen on looking at things like extreme value and reframing it around return probabilities of extreme events, because I feel like that's a better way to kind of relate the climate hazard to maybe a more engineering perspective where you go, actually, I'm designing a building based on, I don't know, winds of a 1,000 year event. So I think reframing it like that is a better way to kind of engage people to use that information more effectively. So that's kind of, yes, thanks.
Thank you very much. One last question. What is your key message that you would like us to know as the researchers and accountants and sustainability experts?
Well, I think from the very beginning, my experience in this space is kind of, I think climate risk is really important. I think people need to assess it, but I also think it should be kind of incorporated into just an overall risk assessment. It's not this special thing. It's just one additional risk. And I think people are really used to the idea of assessing complex risks. Why can't they bring in another risk? So that's sort of something, for example, our work with APRA has really focused on, where they've actually first started with a climate risk assessment, and then they go, well, actually want to mainstream this and actually bring it into people's thinking about, financial sectors, sustainability in a future world. That actually, this is just one part of it. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And please join me in thanking Richard.
Thank you.
So now we have Tom Frick, my colleague from the AASB, who will give us an update on 1 year in with the Sustainability Climate Disclosure Standard. Tom is a senior manager at the Sustainability Reporting team here at the AASB, and he works across the development and implementation of the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. Please welcome Tom.
Thank you, Sabine, and good morning, everyone. It is so great to see such a full room here today and have so many people online as well, to see such great interest in this Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards and what the AASB is up to. We'll just repeat at the start of the presentation, the views here are my own, not necessarily representative of the views of the AASB. So 1 year in, it is over a year ago now that the AASB released AASB S2, and it is strange as a staff member at the AASB to think it's been a year already, because so much has been packed into that year and it has gone so quickly. Now, someone can do a count of how many cliches you hear me talk about today with everything that we always talk about in sustainability reporting, but I'll start off with one in repeating that this really has been the biggest change to corporate reporting in Australia since the introduction of IFRS standards 20 odd years ago. So the AASB has been very deliberate in its approach in recognising that this is such a change in the economy, and we've been very deliberate in the way that we've responded to our implementation support and supporting across the economy to make sure that the implementation of the standard is a success. So in terms of what we'll talk about today, I do want to spend a bit of time talking about the different implementation support activities we've been engaging with and the wide range of resources that we have available now. It's available for you to use as academics to understand the regime and identify research opportunities, as preparers to help in your preparation journey. There's another cliche, add that to the counter. As you're going through the climate reporting journey, for users, for government officials to understand how the regime operates and how you can interact with it. We'll talk briefly about the proposed targeted amendments that are coming through for IFRS and AASB S2, and also looking ahead So what's coming next for the AASB, and particularly for the research community? How can you be involved, and what will be useful to look at for the future topics that are coming in sustainability reporting research? To start off with, I don't want to label this too long as a bit of a history lesson, but where have we come from for the Australian sustainability reporting standards? So it was only just over 2 years ago that the international standards IFRS S1 and S2 were released by the ISSB. The AASB responded by releasing ED-SR1, which was our exposure draft to implement climate-related financial disclosures in Australia. That kicked off the AASB's largest ever public consultation program. We received 117 comment letters for that exposure draft, which was by far a record for the most we've ever received. Had almost 300 survey responses, and in going up and down the country talking to stakeholders, connected with over 1,000 individuals and organisations to hear their feedback. The overwhelming feedback that we heard was a desire for the Australian standards to align with the international standards to the greatest extent possible, while still taking into account the necessary Australian context. So, in September 2024, just over a year ago, the AASB issued AASB S1, which is the voluntary standard for disclosure of general sustainability-related financial information, and the mandatory AASB S2 for climate-related disclosures. And of course, those were released just after the Australian Parliament passed legislation to establish the mandatory climate-related disclosure regime. So, a year old for the standard, and it has been a big year for the AASB in setting out an extensive range of implementation support activities. So, you're probably aware that the climate-related disclosure regime is phased across 3 groups of entities. We're right in the middle of Group 1 at the moment, which started applying the standard from financial years beginning 1st of January 2025. So we're only a few months away from our first entities reporting under the standard. Those entities that have a 31 December year end are coming up to the end of their first period, and we'll be seeing their reports released in a few months into 2026. That's a relatively smaller group compared to the 30 June year-end reporters. So we'll see the big tranche of first lot of reports for Group 1 coming through a bit later through 2026. We then move through into Group 2 and Group 3 entities over the next few years. What you'll notice is that we're not just focused on implementation support, but also awareness raising for the new standards. So there's acknowledgement that this is an entirely new regime of reporting. It's a new way about thinking about how we prepare financial information. And it's bringing a range of stakeholders together within entities to prepare reports that probably haven't been involved in financial reporting in the past. We're bringing together sustainability teams, finance teams, risk management, governance, a wide range of people across entities. So we've been really conscious of the need to get out there with an awareness raising program so that entities know what's coming and know what's going to be required of them. Now, for a lot of our Group 1 entities, which if you look at publicly listed entities, more or less corresponds to about the ASX 200, many of them have already been doing some form of voluntary climate-related reporting already over the last few years. AASB S2 is a step up, but a lot of the ideas about climate reporting are not entirely brand new. It's building on their existing practice to meet the new mandatory requirements. As we move through for Group 2 and Group 3, that's where we probably are not seeing as much of that voluntary take-up of climate-related reporting at the moment, and that's where we'll have more of a role to play in awareness raising, in introducing to those groups of entities what climate change might mean for them, what climate-related risks and opportunities are, and what they might be looking at when they're preparing reports under AASB S2. So we'll jump into some of those implementation support activities in a moment, but what I want to do highlight here as well is down the bottom you'll see we're already looking forward to the evidence gathering and post-implementation review stage of the standard. So it's regular practice for the AASB after a standard has been implemented by entities for around 3 years or so to kick off the post-implementation review process. This is really important so that we can understand, once we've issued a standard, is it working as intended? What are the costs of the standard? What are the benefits of the standard? And how are stakeholders across the economy interacting with it? And that's a really important stage where academic research plays a crucial role. We rely very heavily on the academic community to feed into that process with the amazing research that you can do to understand a range of those costs and benefits. Something we really want to highlight, though, is that it's really important that research starts now to feed into that post-implementation review process. When we get there through 2028 and 2029, we're going to be looking for evidence that already exists in the marketplace. Evidence that we can understand from 2025-26 onwards, as the standards begin to be implemented. What is that implementation journey that entities are going on? What is the experience that entities are having? And how are users interacting and using the information from those reports? We know that high-quality academic research takes time to develop. It takes time to go out and collect the data. It takes time to synthesize it and turn it into useful findings. So we'll touch a bit more on that later, but as we go through the presentation today, for our academics in the room, really try and be conscious about thinking of what are the research opportunities here that you might be able to start to take advantage of today and over the next few months. That's going to be critical to feed into our research program into the future. So I'm hoping for many of you in the room that you're familiar with the AASB S2 Knowledge Hub already, but if you're not, this is intended to be our one-stop shop for the AASB for your support materials to help you with AASB S2, and at the moment particularly targeted with materials towards preparers, so those entities that are going to be part of the climate disclosure regime. So there's a QR code there. You can jump on and have a look as we go through the presentation with the resources that we've got available. But it really is intended to be a wide repository of information that we've got there to help support preparers. So we'll step through some of the resources we've got available. And starting with our guidance documents. So across 2025, we've released a range of guidance documents that look at different parts of the standard and provide a range of technical advice and ways to get started looking at some of the requirements in the standard, and particularly those that are quite new in the S2 context that we haven't seen in financial reporting before. As our standard aligns with the international standard IFRS S1 and S2, our guidance also aligns with guidance that the AASB has released. So it's making sure that entities that are preparing reports in the Australian context have reports that are comparable with international reports. So we started back in April this year with our first document, an overview of AASB S1 and S2. This is a really useful document if you're new to the climate reporting space, or if perhaps you've got experience in climate reporting, but new to the world of financial and reporting standards. The document has some really useful information in setting out how to read standards. What do I need to do in regards to the body of the standard, the appendices, what's the role of the basis for conclusions? It then gets into the basic requirements within AASB S1 and S2, and it has some basic details on the regulatory regime as well, who has to report and when they have to report. So it's a really useful guide to share with a range of stakeholders, and particularly if you're talking with individuals in your entity or within your faculties that are new to the regime, it's a great place to start and a good document to get that introduction to the regime. Next up in July, we released a comparison document comparing AASB S2 to the TCFD requirements. So we know that a lot of entities have been already reporting voluntarily on climate-related risks and opportunities using the TCFD requirements. And S2, in fact, builds on the TCFD requirements by increasing the level of detail and some of the disclosure topics that are required. So this document provides a high-level view starting with the TCFD recommendations and then highlighting where S2 builds on those requirements. So a really useful tool, particularly for a lot of Group 1 and Group 2 entities, getting started with reporting to understand where are some of the areas where they might need to devote a bit more attention and a bit more effort as they're looking to make that step up towards reporting under S2. We then have what has been our most popular guide across the year in terms of clicks and downloads, which is probably no surprise that it's around greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. This is a document which sets out, effectively, it's a long-form FAQ document. Believe me, the answers are in long form with a lot of technical detail around some of the greenhouse gas disclosure requirements in S2. Again, a really useful tool if perhaps you've been involved with greenhouse gas emissions accounting in the past, to understand how does it fit into the S2 framework and what's the role of greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. It talks about GHG emissions being a proxy for a measure of an entity's transition risk, understanding where emissions are located within an entity and its value chain as we transition to a lower carbon economy. And it gets into a fair bit of detail around the application of the greenhouse gas protocol and how an entity prepares and discloses its greenhouse gas emissions information. In September, we have a guide on proportionality. So another common topic. We got a lot of questions around the proportionality mechanisms that are built into AASB S2. It's a short guide which highlights the different proportionality mechanisms that are available and the particular disclosure requirements and areas within the standard where they apply. I won't try and read out the full name of the proportionality mechanisms because it's a bit of a word salad, but it is a useful document in highlighting those particular areas. And finally, last month, we have released our guidance on anticipated financial effects. So a key part of the strategy disclosures within the requirements is disclosing around the anticipated financial effects of climate-related risks and opportunities now and into the future for an entity. So providing some guidance around those requirements, how an entity might go around determining those financial effects, which are forward-looking, and disclosing that within the S2 report. That's definitely not the end of our planned guidance materials. That's what we have on the Knowledge Hub so far. Our planned next document will be guidance on materiality, which hopefully will cover off most of the big topics where we're getting a lot of questions this year, but looking at the application of materiality in the S2 climate and sustainability context. For a lot of you, you'll be familiar with a lot of those materiality concepts, which draws heavily on the same concepts that we use within financial reporting, using broadly the same definition of materiality. You'll notice that a lot of our guidance documents so far are a bit more technically focused and really focused at supporting Group 1 implementation. I'm hopeful that they'll also support Group 2 and Group 3 entities as they come into the regime over the next couple of years. Our implementation and guidance materials will continue to evolve over the next couple of years, though, as our market and audience changes through Group 2 and Group 3 entities. And we'll have some more materials more focused towards those entities over time. Also on the Knowledge Hub, you'll find our frequently asked questions page, which is becoming increasingly popular. We've split this into two halves. Firstly, there's general FAQs, which cover some broad concepts around the climate disclosure regime, how it's going to be enforced. And we do have some helpful links to resources from our colleagues at ASIC, where we get into some areas where there is overlap between S2 and the Corporations Act, the scope and application of the standards. What many of you are probably more interested in, though, is the technical FAQs. In the technical FAQs, we dive into a few particular topics where we're getting some common questions to help entities in applying particular requirements of the standard. So it's worth noting that S2 is broadly a principles-based standard, like all of our Australian accounting standards are. So the intention there is an acknowledgement that for every entity and for every industry, climate-related risks and opportunities manifest in very different ways. So it's important that entities have the flexibility to be able to apply the standard in a way that meets their own facts and circumstances. So it does mean that not every question that we get we can provide a direct answer to, or the answer we usually provide is, it depends. What we can do, though, and we've tried to do through our FAQs, is provide some guidance around how particular requirements in the standard can be interpreted, and provide some guidance to help entities understand how should I be applying that in my facts and circumstances. So our FAQs page was set up a few months ago where we had a range of questions there, but we have been updating it over the last few weeks and months as more questions come through. So if you've seen it before, some of the questions that we've added just in the last few weeks, we've got a question up clarifying around the scope of climate-related targets that an entity needs to disclose information about under S2. A question as well around how should an entity determine which emission factors best represent its greenhouse gas emissions. So we will be continuing to update that over time as we get questions through that we're able to provide some additional guidance on. So that's definitely one page to bookmark and look back over time as we add to those questions. As well on our Knowledge Hub, we are starting to collate a series of third-party resources from other Australian government agencies. Richard this morning showed us some fantastic work that the Australian Climate Service has been doing. And many of those resources we have linked to on our Knowledge Hub as resources that we think will be very useful for preparers in helping to get their climate-related disclosures together. We've got links through to the National Climate Risk Assessment, some other resources from the CSIRO, the Department of Climate Change, energy, environment and water, our colleagues at ASIC as well. So a broad range of resources to help an entity understand how it should be identifying its climate-related risks and opportunities, some of the more background elements around climate, but then also moving to what are some data sources and inputs that an entity can use when you're getting to things like scenario analysis and looking for where you should be starting. Again, we're planning to update that regularly in the coming year as more resources become available that are useful. Another key pillar of our implementation program across the year has been the AASB S2 Implementation Advisory Panel. So the panel's been convened for around 6 months now. The idea of the panel is that we're bringing together a range of individuals that are involved in the climate disclosure regime, particularly looking at the implementation for Group 1 entities this year, to come together and to be able to provide information to the AASB on implementation experiences and be able to provide some discussion around implementation queries that different stakeholders might have. So we have a broad range of perspectives on the panel. We have preparers and a range of Group 1 and some Group 2 preparers at the moment. We have professional service advisory firms represented. We have investors represented. We also have a non-executive director sitting on the panel as well to provide that board and governance perspective. So the panel serves a couple of functions. Firstly, any stakeholder can submit a question through to the AASB advisory panel for the panel to consider. So you can click through on the Knowledge Hub, which has links through to the panel where we do have some criteria set out for the panel to discuss implementation issues, to understand and help the AASB and staff understand if there are particular areas where the AASB and staff can provide additional support. Indeed, some of the discussions the panel has had this year has led to some of the FAQs that we've been updating on our Knowledge Hub. Even if a question doesn't meet the strict criteria that we do have for the panel, we have an approach of trying to be as helpful as possible and understanding if there's areas where we can clarify how particular disclosure requirements are intended to be applied, or if there are areas where we can provide some additional guidance. So the panel did actually just meet yesterday afternoon for our last meeting, where we were able to consider and look at a range of issues that had been submitted by stakeholders across the last couple of months. And do be on the lookout over the next couple of weeks for the public meeting summary to be released so you can see what was discussed at the meeting, and the submission log as well. In that we address some of the questions that have been submitted to the panel and help provide some guidance on how entities might approach some of those implementation questions. The panel also serves to feed up into the ISSB's Transition Implementation Group, or the TIG, which is effectively the same model as the panel, but at the international level, where they're also looking at implementation questions that are applicable at the international standards level. As Australia is at the forefront of implementing standards that are aligned to the international standards, we want to make sure that we're able to feed up feedback into the TIG's process as they're considering a range of issues. So the TIG is meeting later this week, and as part of our advisory panel meeting yesterday afternoon, we discussed some of the issues that the TIG will be discussing later in the week. And we have a mechanism to feed up that feedback into the TIG so that the Australian perspective is being considered. As I touched on, an example here of where we have been able to be helpful in responding to some of the submissions that we've had towards the panel. So we received a question a little bit early in the year around which particular climate-related targets an entity is required to disclose information about in the metrics and targets section of AASB S2. As I said, we've got a principles-based standard, we can't provide a definitive list of exactly what targets an entity should be disclosing about, but we've put an FAQ up on our website which provides some guidance on the considerations that an entity might make to determine if they do have a target that they need to disclose information about to meet the requirements of the standard. So can't stress enough, Knowledge Hub is your one-stop shop. Bookmark that page, visit it regularly. We will be updating that over time. Many of you will have also seen for our implementation activities a range of events across the year. One of our great events we held this year was back in August. We were lucky enough that Sue Lloyd, who is the Vice Chair of the ISSB, was visiting Australia. And in Sydney, we were able to hold a 2-day training workshop going through AASB S2 at quite a range of technical detail. Good to see a lot of familiar faces in the room today that were along for that training session. Staff, board members and the AASB chair have been out and about throughout the year, going to a range of conferences and events as part of our awareness raising in particular, to get the message out there that the standard is out there to be applied and when it's coming in, providing some of that implementation support. And indeed, we've been engaging with the academic community a lot as well. So again, it was great to see so many people at AFANS earlier in the year and see a lot of you come to the AASB booth. And we're very keen to continue that engagement with the research community. If anything, we're only planning to scale up these activities further next year. So if you are interested in hearing more about our events program and what's coming next for the AASB, make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, give us a follow on LinkedIn, because we are using those channels very regularly to put out to our network what is coming next for the AASB. And finally, on implementation, making sure that we're continuing our support and collaboration with other government agencies that are involved in the implementation of the climate disclosure regime. So of course, we keep in close contact with our sister board, the AASB, setting the auditing and assurance standards for the sustainability standards. And you can see the fantastic work that they're doing in their board meetings at the moment. The Treasury continues to set the policy direction for the regime. But we've also been working very closely with ASIC in recent months as well, in making sure that the regulatory regime and the standard are complementary. But we also do have, as you may have seen, a partnership with ASIC to develop capacity building education materials in the climate space. So we will have some education materials coming out in the coming months, which look at providing an introduction and a basis for climate-related disclosures, helping those individuals which are new to the world of climate reporting. So understanding how climate change impacts on a business, how to understand climate-related risks and opportunities, providing that initial grounding which can help an entity get ready and capacity build to move towards reporting under AASB S2. So very excited to see those materials develop and be released to the market in the near future. Okay, so turning now to the proposed targeted amendments to IFRS S2 and AASB S2. So it's not often that within the first year of a standard and or in the initial stages of implementation that we see amendments coming through to a standard. It's important to stress that the amendments that are being proposed here to the standard are very targeted and very focused on very particular elements of greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. Things move at a very lightning pace in sustainability reporting. These amendments are still in the process of being finalised by the AASB for the particular wording that we're going to see amended into the international standard. We do have a pretty firm direction of travel that's been given by the AASB as they've decided on the direction of travel of what the amendments will look like, and we're waiting to see the final wording, which will be finalised in the next few weeks. Very quickly, we'll just touch on the disclosure requirements that the amendments relate to. I won't go into them in too much technical detail. We'll be here all day, but touch on them briefly so you can understand, particularly if you're a Group 1 reporting entity, are these amendments that I should be aware of in preparing my first set of disclosures. So we can really categorise them into two halves. The first two amendments, 1 and 2, relate to clarifying disclosure requirements around an entity's Scope 3 Category 15 greenhouse gas emissions. So those are emissions for an entity's financed emissions, where it makes investments, and emissions associated in its value chain through investments. First Amendment clarifies that insurance-associated and derivatives-associated emissions will not be required to be disclosed as part of those disclosures, as methodologies in those areas are still developing and not quite robust enough yet for disclosures to be comparable and of a high quality. Second Amendment is around for particular entities in particular industries around commercial banking, insurance and investments. There are particular disclosure requirements required to disaggregate Scope 3 in Category 15 emissions by and classify them by industry. The amendments will clarify that an entity is not required to use GICS, the Global Industry Classification Standard System, but it's able to use a classification system that helps provide useful information to its users. For a lot of entities, that may be GICS, but it will be able to provide a choice that entities are able to make a choice that is reasonable on their facts and circumstances. The second two amendments, 3 and 4, focus around the clarification of some jurisdictional reliefs that are within the standard. So entities that are required by a jurisdiction or an exchange to use a particular greenhouse gas emissions measurement methodology to measure emissions can continue to do so to measure their emissions under S2 for those parts of the entity required to do so. So for Australian entities, a lot of them will be captured by the NGA reporting scheme. And if they're required by NGA to use the NGA methodology, they can continue to use that to measure their greenhouse gas emissions for the purposes of S2, instead of using the greenhouse gas protocol, which is the default method under S2. The third amendment clarifies that if it's only a particular part or section of the entity that jurisdictional relief applies to, that the jurisdictional requirement applies to, then the relief only applies to that part of an entity. So under the NGA scheme, where it may be an entire entity that is captured by NGA thresholds, or it might be a particular facility and just a section of an entity that is captured by a threshold. So it clarifies it's only those parts of the entity that the requirement applies to are able to apply that relief. And it's the same principle for the fourth and final amendment as well, but in the context of the use of global warming potential values. Again, it's the part of the entity that requirement to use particular global warming potential values applies to. That part of the entity can continue to use those values. In terms of where we are in the timeline for these amendments, it has been quite a lightning pace to get these through in 2025. So it was back in April that the AASB released their exposure draft with proposed amendments, and the AASB released an exposure draft on proposed amendments to AASB S2 in these areas as well. We gathered a range of feedback from Australian stakeholders to understand how those amendments might play out in the Australian context. We were able to feed that feedback up to the AASB as well. Feedback has been considered over the last few months, and we're in the stage over the next few weeks. We're expecting the AASB to finalise those amendments with final wording into the standard. The aim for the AASB is that we will also complete amendments to AASB S2 before the end of this calendar year. That would enable, the intention is to enable entities that have a 31 December year-end reporting for this year, our first tranche of Group 1 entities, to be able to apply those amendments. So that's the intention. So stay tuned for that. There will be a bit coming out from the AASB over the next few weeks as we move through the process of finalising those amendments. So I want to finish off with looking ahead. We've talked a lot about our activities so far through 2025, but what's coming in 2026? And in particular, what are the opportunities for research to be involved? So coming back to the post-implementation review, it's something we're really cognizant of at the AASB in thinking about as soon as this standard begins to be implemented, we want to start the evidence gathering process. So by the time we get to the formal post-implementation review in a few years, we've already started to build up that evidence base in understanding what's happening with the standard. So we've got the broad objective there, assess whether new standards are working as intended by considering impacts on a range of stakeholders. Now, one of the questions we often get from the research community is, I'd love to be involved with the post-implementation review and providing useful information to the AASB, but where do I start? And we thought a great resource to be able to draw on is looking at some literature that the IFRS Foundation has put out before. So the IFRS Foundation, the ISSB, just like us, will be conducting a post-implementation review of the international standards as well. When IFRS S1 and S2 were released, the ISSB released an effects analysis document. And this sets out the expected costs and benefits of the standard as it's being implemented. It's a prediction of what we're expecting to see as the standards become implemented. It's a great place to go and look at, well, this is what we expected to see when we started with the standard. What have we actually seen as it's become implemented? And one of the key things I want to touch on here is that it's looking at costs and benefits. Often when we get to the review stage, we do find a lot more research and evidence available on the costs. And evidence on the cost is often a lot easier and quicker to find. As entities are implementing the standard, we can go and talk to them and understand what are the costs, what are the investments that are needing to be made to upskill systems and processes, to be able to upskill human capital expertise and get the right people in place to be able to prepare these reports. We can find a lot of evidence on that, and it can be a bit more immediate to find that evidence. What can be a bit more long-term and a bit more difficult to find is evidence on the benefits and the uses of a standard. And we are really interested in that evidence because at the end of the day, the standard is being implemented to provide useful information to users. So it is critical we can understand how is a standard being used. There's a great quote from the effects analysis document there. Benefits develop over time and are often more subtle and implicit than costs, and the effects may need to be evaluated over the longer term. So it's a tougher question for us to get evidence on the uses and benefits of a standard, but that is the perfect place for academic research to come in, and that's why we rely so heavily on the academic community to have input into this process. So we know that academics can provide the rigor and the innovative research methods to be able to answer some of these longer term and difficult questions. So we'd love you to start thinking about getting involved in setting up research projects now to understand some of these effects of the standard and looking at from as we begin implementing now and the first entities start reporting over the next few years. What are we seeing? So to finish off, what's coming for next year, 2026 and beyond, our implementation activities will be continuing. So the Knowledge Hub, that will be continue to be updated regularly as we get new resources and new FAQs that we can provide. Our implementation support is going to start to be targeted a bit more towards group 2 and 3 as well, as they get closer to joining the mandatory regime. And you'll see some of our education and guidance materials will start to be framed a bit more towards a different audience of those group 2 and group 3 preparers. And ongoing industry engagement, starting to engage with a range of different industry bodies, which we're finding is a fantastic place for preparers and entities to collate their experiences and thoughts and be able to feed that through to the AASB. And we want to be able to understand disclosure practices. So as I said, preparing for the post-implementation review, but understanding, not waiting until the post-implementation review comes around to understand the implementation practices and experiences from the preparer perspective, from the user perspective as well. And we're planning to engage in a real-time monitoring and implementation program to understand as we start to see those first reports being disclosed, what are we seeing? How are our entities applying judgment? How are they preparing and presenting disclosures differently across different industries and between different entities? And I'll just end with some of the different research opportunities. So for the academics in the crowd, these are the real areas where we don't see too much evidence at the moment. So these are the opportunities within the literature, within the academic community to move forward and provide some novel research that also informs standard setting and is linked to practice. So understanding the uses of climate-related disclosures, impacts on capital markets and on different investor groups, implementation insights, connectivity between financial information and sustainability information within annual reports, which I know will be a topic discussed more over the next couple of days. And also looking internally into businesses from a management accounting perspective as well. What kind of development are we going to be seeing in systems and internal processes and how entities are structured in order to deliver high quality reporting? The overall message is we want to hear from you. We want to engage with you through this process. So if you're interested in sustainability research, if you're engaging in research projects around the climate disclosure regime, come and talk to us, have a talk to our staff today, or drop us a line after the conference this week. We'd love to engage with you and see if there's opportunities, how we might be able to support you and get involved in the research, or how we might be able to learn something useful from it that we can take forward to inform our standard setting now and into the future. So there we have it. That's our whistle-stop, very quick tour of 1 year of AASB S2. We've got the QR codes there at Knowledge Hub, and we've got QR codes there as well for subscribing to our newsletter and following our LinkedIn as well. So as I said, if you want to keep up with our, as we produce those new materials and release them and our program of events across the next year, make sure you follow us on those channels so you can keep up to date. Otherwise, thanks very much. Happy to take a few questions.
Thank you very much, Tom, for sharing with us what the AASB has been up to in the sustainability space. It's been a busy year. So we do have some audience questions, and I might just start off with one that looks at those companies that have already voluntarily started to implement our climate-related disclosure standard and are now moving to a mandatory implementation. So the question is, based on what you have observed in practice, what are some of the main changes that these entities will need to make, moving from the voluntary to the mandatory disclosures? And what resources and actions are these entities taking to help support the implementation journey?
Yeah, thanks, Sabine. A lot we could unpack in that question, so I might touch on a couple of high-level areas. It is really encouraging. We're starting to see some entities, even before the mandate for climate disclosures coming in, starting to do voluntary reports that are aligned or moving towards alignment with AASB S2, and a lot of entities that will be caught by the regime next year doing a dry run or practice run of reporting this year. So we're starting to see some of the lessons from implementation from that already. So I'd say one of the main things we're seeing from the step up from voluntary to mandatory disclosure is that there's more teams and more individuals involved within reporting entities now to get the S2 report together. So it's not just a sustainability team preparing the report. It's in many entities, the reporting function is moving over to a CFO or financial team within an entity. But it's bringing together a range of people, risk management, governance, and having board oversight of the process as well. So we're seeing a lot of that change internally, which is really helping entities make sure they've got the range of expertise that they need in order to prepare a report. But in terms of what else is useful, I'll take the opportunity to plug the Knowledge Hub once again. There's a really good range of resources there to help entities as they're getting started on that journey. So if you're not sure where to look and struggling for what kind of resources will be helpful as you're starting to put together that plan of how to move towards that S2 implementation, that's a really useful place to start.
Thank you, Tom. Another question is probably closely related. You mentioned the implementation advisory panel. And so the audience question is, what are some of the recurring issues and questions that have come up in that panel?
Yeah, good question. Look, and a great resource to look at when it becomes available in the next couple of weeks will be our meeting summaries and submission log, which you'll be able to see a summary of the issues the panel's discussed so far. We've had a few questions, like I touched on before, that we've updated with some FAQs on our Knowledge Hub. So some areas looking at particular areas of applying judgment within the standards around areas like targets or preparing greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. We have had a few questions as well overlapping with how to apply S2 in the context of requirements in the Corporations Act. The AASB does not administer the Corporations Act. That is the responsibility of ASIC, but there are some areas there where we're able to direct people to where there are some great resources available from ASIC that can help them with those questions as well.
Thank you, Tom. One last audience question is, at its November meeting, the AASB decided to begin standard setting work on nature-related disclosures. Is the AASB expected to follow?
Yes, great question. Yes, so nature, the next topic for the ISSB. So we can look at what the ISSB has decided there so far. So the ISSB has decided to begin a standard setting project on nature-related disclosures. And so far they've said that will draw on the work of the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which follows a broadly similar structure to the TCFD. Important to note that's about all that the ISSB has decided so far. So there's not yet any clear detail on exactly what that standard setting is going to look like and what we might actually see coming out of nature. So there is still a long way to go there in developing that standard. From an Australian perspective, I can't speak for the board, of course, but it is something that our board will be looking at in the coming months to understand whether there might be a role for Australia to begin any kind of standard setting process. Worth noting as well that the AASB has the power to issue sustainability standards, but it's a decision for the government to decide if any standards should be made mandatory to be applied. So no panic stations yet that in a few months we're going to be standing up here talking about a mandatory nature standard. A long way to go yet before we get anywhere near a complete standard for nature.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tom. Please join me in thanking Tom. And now I've got some good news and some bad news. So I'll start with the bad news. We don't have an official morning tea break, but we do realize that maybe someone would like to go and catch up on their coffee. So we do have chocolates and we do have 5 minutes. So please take those 5 minutes before we go to the next panel conversation. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. If I could please ask you to take your seat again. Thank you. Okay, so we'll start with our first panel conversation on practical implementation insights. Again, it is my great pleasure to introduce the panel to you. So we have here Samantha Sinki, who is a partner of sustainability reporting advisory at Grant Thornton, where she guides her clients through the complexity of local and international sustainability reporting standards and offers practical implementation solutions tailored for each entity. Sam is also a member of the AASB S2 implementation advisory panel. Then our second panel member is Adrian King. Adrian is a partner in charge of KPMG's ESG Advisory and Assurance Services team in Australia, and he has led KPMG's global capability in thinking in ESG, climate change, and sustainability services for many years. Adrian has more than 35 years of experience working with public and private companies globally, providing financial and non-financial advisory, reporting, and assurance services. Adrian is also a member of the AASB board. Next, we have Chi Man Wu. She is a partner at Deloitte's Climate and Sustainability Practice with over 24 years experience in providing sustainability advisory and assurance services in the United Kingdom, South Africa, and Australia. She is particularly passionate about working with businesses on technologies that enable deeper appreciation of and accelerated action on climate change and sustainability challenges. And she is also a member of the AASB board. So last but not least, Jennifer Chung is joining us virtually. Jennifer is head of sustainability at AirTrunk, and Jennifer established and leads the AirTrunk sustainability, ESG, and governance strategy. Jennifer has prioritized early adoption of new standards and continuously works to redefine ESG excellence in the data center industry. The session today will be moderated by my colleague, Caris Halliday, AASB Director of Strategy and Co-Lead Sustainability. Please join me in welcoming the panel and the moderator.
Thank you, Sabine. Jennifer, perhaps before we kick into the panel discussion, would you like to give a little bit more context about AirTrunk, perhaps for those in the audience who aren't familiar with what AirTrunk does?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Caris. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer. I lead sustainability at AirTrunk. And if you have not heard of AirTrunk, we operate a large hyperscale data center across Asia Pacific and Japan. And this year, we chose to voluntarily early adopt AASB S2 as a private company, and we invited our financial auditors, KPMG, to conduct limited assurance earlier this year. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. Could you also share with us what the motivations were for AirTrunk deciding to early adopt AASB S2?
Yes, absolutely. So our report, prepared in accordance with AASB S2, was officially launched end of October 2025. And for us, early S2 adoption was a practical choice. We recognize that expectations on private companies are rising quickly, whether from investors, banks, or global regulatory convergence. Early adoption meant we could get ahead of the curve and build the same level of discipline expected of public entities. We also operate across Asia Pacific with varying climates, varying level of water stress, and regulatory settings. So the work is naturally complex. So going early gave us the time to work through that complexity and gave us that rare space to identify where exposures vary across sites and market, test the pathways in enough depth to understand the implication for our design, our operation, and planning, and prepare the organization early so our team had time to understand the finding, stress test them, and consider the operational implication. And once we work through the analysis, the priority become very clear. Which risk and opportunity genuinely matters and which don't, And that clarity was one of the biggest benefits of adopting early. And as importantly, it gave us an opportunity to test a full assurance cycle with our auditors. And doing that while the standard was still fresh meant we could work together through interpretation, documentation, and evidence in a more thoughtful way and well ahead of the timeline. Yeah.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sam, hearing those motivations, I'm interested in what resonates with you for your Group 2 or Group 3 entities who are also early adopting.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. What I'm really starting to see is there are so many companies in the private sector where historically they've not been the huge focus of any kind of academic research or climate-related disclosures because they're not listed companies. But actually, I think there was a recent paper that came out as a joint between Monash University and Purpose Bureau. If you look at the Group 1 companies captured by December this year, the majority of those December year ends are actually companies that are private. And for many of these companies, they have been preparing Tier 2 financial statements. So not your full-blown, full amount of disclosures that you would expect, but they're preparing simplified disclosure AASB 1060 financial statements. And for these companies, while they may not have historically thought about disclosures as a huge amount of information useful for their users, when they start to consider these climate-related risks and opportunities, they suddenly realize there's huge strategic implications for their company. And so they are actually finding so much value in doing this analysis as part of understanding their business resilience.
Thank you. So now that we've talked about the why, Jennifer, I'm sure people would be really interested here to understand the how. You must have been working to a pretty tight time frame as we only issued AASB S2 last September, and then you've released your report in October this year. Could you talk us through your implementation approach?
Of course, and yes, the time frame was tight, so we had to be very deliberate about our approach. And when S2 came out, we didn't start by writing a report. We really broke down the work into 4 simple steps. Step 1 was around scoping and gaps. We took a honest look at where we already had strong practice and where the gaps were in data, in how we were thinking about climate, and in documentation. We also agreed the scope early, which site, which time horizon, and how far down the value chain we will go. And that gave us a realistic baseline and clear focus. Step 2 was getting governance and role in place. We set up a cross-functional working group, and we brought our board and senior leaders in at the very beginning and not the end. And we walk them through the scenario we will use, the timeframes, the key decision they will eventually be asked to make. And that early discussion meant everyone was clear on the direction, and we were not reopening fundamentals later on. Step 3 was doing the risk and opportunity scenario work in a way that matched our business runs. Rather than starting with the AASB template, we looked at each site on its own: temperature trends, cooling performance, water availability, local regulation. And then we pulled that up into a portfolio view of all our sites. We also align on what materiality means for air trunk, and that really helped us to narrow many potential risk and opportunity into the few that truly matters for resilient data center operations. Step 4 was really turning that analysis into a report and getting it ready for assurance. So we designed it as an air trunk document, something that our own team and our investor will recognize, and then use an appendix to map back to every S2 requirement, similar to how we would use a GRI index for a sustainability report. And as a private company, we also had to be clear about our judgment calls, what we could disclose using dollar figures, and where a qualitative explanation was more accurate or more appropriate. And lastly, because we went for limited assurance, we built an evidence-based early assumption, data sources, control, instead of trying to patch it together at the end. Really looking back, that's the approach that worked for us and is easily transferable to other organizations working towards S2 implementation. Yeah.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's very insightful. So Chi, I might throw to you next. So one aspect that Jennifer mentioned related to how AirTrunk ensured that their board was meaningfully able to contribute throughout this implementation process. And I'm wondering, how are you seeing clients approaching this with their boards?
Thank you. Before I answer that, can I just say that everything Jennifer has said is totally aligned with, I think, what we're seeing early reporters do. The 4 dimensions there, amazingly well described. So that's good to see, right? So in terms of the governance, how the market's engaging with their boards, I think it's I would say in there's a pathway to that. There is what we normally see is a conversation with the board initially about the new requirements, because not all board members are across the requirements and directors' responsibilities with respect to those new requirements as well. So that education piece connected to training or awareness building about how S2 the requirements align with or are enabled or it's made mandatory through the Corps Act, and how directors actually have personal liability as much as they do for financial reporting is part of that conversation to get boards to engage. Sometimes though, we see, depending on, it's different for different boards, but sometimes it's the boards that lead on the questions about compliance ahead of management. They often, because they work in other boards as well, they often come to management with what are we doing about this? Are we caught? Can we just check which group we sit in, and who's going to do this assessment on readiness for reporting? So again, it's not a standard story.
Thank you. Adrian, is there anything you'd like to add to that, or perhaps other aspects of implementation approach that you might like to highlight?
So the first thing I'd say is definitely bring the board along. They're either ahead of management or they're behind. Very rarely are they in lockstep at the beginning of the process. And then obviously the whole point of this is to bring them gradually into line so that when you actually hit the reporting deadline, everybody is there and not surprised. The thing I would add to that, though, is I think Jennifer's point about the reporting was step 4. And I do see that too many, we're working with good old, yes, AirTrunk, absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer, for being one of the first, if not the first, in the public domain. But there's also an awful lot of organizations who are doing it privately behind the scenes as a dry run or pre-assurance or whatever you want to call it. And I think the thing we're seeing constantly as a difference is, or an over complication, is that they're actually doing 2 things at the same time. This is a risk assessment and reporting. This was brought in at the very beginning. If you go all the way back to the FSB and TCFD, this was all about understanding of climate risks and communicating those climate risks to the client, to the capital market, so that there's no major crash because of information disparity. There are 2 things. They say climate risk assessment and reporting. And I think you've got to try and keep those 2 separate, because climate risk requires certain decisions, a certain understanding of the business, and probably different participants. And reporting should be just the reporting what the organization's already doing. If you let them merge too much together, you end up sort of drafting a report, and then someone says, oh, what's our risks, or what should we do about that risk, and how should we communicate that? It's like, well, that's the wrong answer. What are you doing about it is what you should be reporting, not trying to work out what you want to say and how do you just manage some of the reputational challenges. So I do think one of the key points here is pull them apart, do the risk assessment, do it well, work out what material is to your organization, and then step 4, as Jennifer said, the last step, write it down on a piece of paper and report it. And I think that can simplify the process quite significantly.
Thank you.
Can I just add to, I think that point Adrian just mentioned about assessment and reporting is really important, because we do see in the market a perception that this is a disclosure disclosure standards. So it's all about reporting, right? I just need to make sure that I've got somebody ready to draft something in month 11 or whatever, and it will be okay. I think the failure to appreciate, as Richard has pointed out from the earlier presentation, that there's a lot of assessments that need to be absorbed and understood and carried out to even begin to report.
Yeah. And I think there's a huge part of the market where people say, well, I don't want to disclose that I'm not doing anything about a climate risk that I've identified. The standard doesn't actually require you to do something in relation to your climate risk. It just asks you to disclose information about what is the entity's strategy in relation to it. So it could be the case that you're currently not doing anything about a climate risk that you've identified because you're still very early in that climate risk assessment journey. And that's perfectly acceptable, but then everyone gets worried about the perception of how will that be perceived by the market if I disclose I'm not doing anything about my climate risks. So.
Yep. And then you gradually drift into greenwash. And that's where you don't want to be. You want to be reporting what you're actually doing. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think that's really insightful on approach. And I am seeing a lot of nods around the audience, so it's resonating. Jennifer, now that you're on the other side of publishing your first report, what are your key insights from implementation?
Thank you, Caris. I want to jump in again that it's really not all about reporting. Really great point just discussed. Not that we've completed our report, a few insights really stand out, and I hope they are helpful for organization going through this right now. The first insight is that climate risk and opportunity quickly become a strategic conversation. Once you start analyzing it side by side, market by market, it becomes clear what genuinely matters for long-term resilience, and that shift from reporting to strategic clarity was significant for us. The second insight is around materiality. The process forces you to be precise about what really matters for your business, considering the nature of impacts, the likelihood, the site sensitivities, the time horizon, and what resilient design requires in our sector. And that clarity really narrowed a long list of theoretical risk to a focused set of priority risk and opportunities. The third insight is that climate and nature are increasingly connected from a resilience perspective. And that's why we combine both topics into one report. So that's a climate and nature related risk report, aligning with S2 for climate and TNFD for nature. And the underlying drivers really overlap. And with TNFD moving under AASB in 2026, it makes sense to bring them together early on. The fourth insight is that judgment is unavoidable. Really being transparent about those judgments, especially as a private company, really strengthen trust and credibility of our report. And finally, the process build internal capability. So by working through pathways, scenario, site level exposure, our team now look at physical risk and opportunity through a much longer term lens than before. And it's really changed how we plan and make decisions across the business. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. I might touch, Adrian, on the assurance side. And how are you seeing clients approaching assurance, and then how are you working together with them on this journey?
Very positively, very constructively, and it's a beautiful experience. A couple other comments.
Come on, stop there.
I think the key thing I'd say is this is new to everybody, and in particular, it's new to the directors. And I think most boards are looking for somebody to help them ensure they achieve compliance. Now, assurance in the first year is only over governance and the risk identification, but the directors are signing a director's declaration across the whole lot. And so I do see that certainly listed companies in particular are asking the assurance providers either publicly or privately to help them ensure that they're compliant, basically. Say, if this had been done for 20 or 30 years, probably wouldn't need it. But in the first couple of years, or first year in particular, it's new. And so I do think a lot of directors and boards are looking for comfort, and that's really where assurance comes in. It is, in theory, that's exactly what it is providing. Of course, the ultimate goal is, these standards are there for consistency, comparability, and reliable information. Well, we know that over the last 20 years, there's been a huge amount of greenwashing in this space, and the assurance will eliminate some of that, in particular, because it needs to be verifiable and reliable. So ultimately, that's the real value of assurance. But I think in the year one, it is about just helping achieve compliance with a new standard.
Thank you, Chair. I can see you writing notes furiously. What would you like to add?
Capturing what Adrian was saying.
Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think as Adrian said, year one is limited to governance, risk and opportunities, and scope 1, scope 2. And in Australia, I think a lot of organizations, particularly Group 1, may have had exposure already to both reporting of scope 1 and scope 2, as well as the assurance thereof. And so I think the kind of uncertainty in the market in relation to year one assurance has really been about, or it really is about, particularly risk and opportunities, what the auditors need to see, etc., and what kind of level of comfort do directors need to see as well, so that they can sign off on the declaration. And so I think moving into year two is where the biggest effort's going to be. And I would say it's an effort both on the reporter's side as well as the auditor's side, remembering that the phasing standard that was issued 5010, it's largely in recognition that time is needed for the auditing profession to build out capability, right? It's not about the reporters, because reporters have to report everything from year one. So I think the reporters, though, are absolutely conscious that whatever they issue from year one, it's got to be good enough to go for the long term. So yes, whilst scope 1 and the 3 dimensions are the elements that are going to be assured, they're often asking auditors already, the financial auditors, to either informally opine or give comment about whether there's anything in the way they're talking about strategy or scenarios of business resilience that in any way would come unstuck in year two, because they don't want that to happen. So that conversation, I'm sure, is taking place across the board.
Thank you. I'm certainly hearing a lot of entities thinking of assurance as being an enabler. It's really helping them as they're lifting their internal capabilities, processes. And so it's great to hear that is working out in the market and your experiences as well. So I am seeing quite a few questions coming through. And if you do have questions that you want to add, get them through to Pigeonhole. I am going to go to one of those now, and it's on financial effects and perhaps anticipated financial effects as well. And the question is, what are you seeing around whether entities are trending towards qualitative or quantitative disclosures at this stage? Who would like to have the first go at that one?
So I'll go. I think there's actually more quant than I was expecting, I have to say. And I do encourage my clients that I'm working with to actually go as hard as they can, especially internally, to work out how they can quantify what information they need, what gaps may or may not exist, and then to assess whether that information is useful to the users based on how reliable it is or how rubbery it may be. So certainly, if an piece of information has too much estimation uncertainty, it is not useful, and it probably would suggest it probably shouldn't be into the market. But you've got to go through that process to estimate that and assess that. So go hard, go internally, and go as far as you can, and then make the assessment about whether it should be consumed externally. I use the analogy of disclosure of legal litigations in financial statements is a useful analogy. So yes, there might be an ambit claim for $100 billion out there. You wouldn't necessarily put that into your notes, but you would disclose that there is a risk, and then you would do work internally to work out, well, what's the legal costs, what's the insurance, what's the net cost, should I settle? It would be lots of work, but you wouldn't necessarily say it's going to cost me this much, because honestly, at that point in time, you do not know. So it doesn't mean you haven't done the work. It just means you've then assessed what is useful, because if you put really rubbery information out into the market, I actually think that's almost worse. So you've got to make that assessment, but you can't make the assessment, I guess is the point, until you've done the analysis.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think that the tricky part is many companies say, oh, I want a minimum compliance approach. I just want to disclose the absolute minimum of the standard. But if you say, I want a minimum compliance approach, you need to know whether or not you've got the data to then require those disclosures in the first place. If you look at the standard, this is getting technical now, but paragraph 19 and 20 is your two kind of paragraphs in the standard where you can see whether or not you need to disclose the quantitative information. And even if you can't disclose that quantitative information, there's still qualitative information you need to disclose. And that requires coming down to the financial statement line item or the subtotals or totals that you need to be able to identify in relation to that risk or opportunity. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg there where you can't actually prove that you have met that requirement in the standard until you've done the work to prove it up.
Thank you. So another question that's come through. It says, Jennifer mentioned the importance of governance as a key step in implementing the new reporting standard, and she touched on the role of the board. Can the other panel members comment on how well governance structures support judgments and estimation, specifically for climate scenario analysis and target setting?
I'll kick in first. I actually think in Australia, we're quite lucky. Governance structures and risk management frameworks are typically pretty good by global standards. So I don't think we're seeing huge challenges. The biggest challenge is the assessments of what is material. And that is a process and a conversation about, and it's not about what's material risks, it's actually about what's the material information that needs to be disclosed. So it does get a bit precise, but the actual governance and typical risk management components, I don't think a problem because it's quite ingrained actually into the corp sector already.
So the only thing I'll add here is I think what I'm starting to see is when you talk to directors and execs that are in charge of disclosure, it does come down to three kind of aspects of board engagement. There are some choices that need to be made that are embedded in the standards, choices about operational control, financial control for greenhouse gas emissions, for example. There are some judgments to be made as well. And there's so those judgments are pervasive throughout the standards. And decisions on the choices and decisions on judgments have to be taken through to the board, right? And so how are they engaging? When are they engaging on? And I think Jennifer mentioned that as well. Early engagement and decisions and oversight and, if you like, approval from the board of all these elements, really key building blocks of assessment and disclosure are pretty important to do. You cannot wait until the last minute to do those things because they set the pathway for how you're going to implement typically a kind of 12-month implementation program for S2 reporting.
Thank you. One thing I often hear said is that if you take a compliance-only mindset, you get all of the costs, but you miss out on potentially a lot of the benefits. And along those lines, this question's come in to say, how do you get boards and management comfortable with full transparency rather than taking a bare minimum compliance-only approach?
Can you let me know when you figure out the answer to that? Because I think it is absolutely true that it is kind of pervasive in the marketplace, right? That there is a tone of minimal compliance, and I wonder whether I suspect it's partly because, as was mentioned by the previous presentation, there is a move of the ownership of this reporting process to going from sustainability to finance, and therefore going from an area of appreciation and also the source of where ambitions are set for sustainability to an area of less familiarity. And I think that discomfort with lack of familiarity actually leads to naturally caution, hesitation, and maybe dialing back of the ambition potentially. But I think it's a big challenge. I would love to see how this whole agenda does not lead to the breaking of ambition, breaking, as I said, the slowing down of ambition, but the acceleration of it, right? I mean, we're supposed to be seeing this drive, as was mentioned before, improve resilience and improve competitiveness in our economy. And ultimately, that will be the test of whether this is successful or not. Has it led to organizations driving better ambition?
I think there is another element to this, which is, a lot of private companies are not used to disclosing this much information about their business governance strategy, etc. This information has generally been considered commercially sensitive historically. I think there is a huge open question as to, for private companies, and this is maybe where research can get involved, for private companies specifically, how is their information being used and disseminated? Because I know from practice that it is of interest, even if they are a private company, whether it's a transaction or a bank or something else happening, the information is of use. But most of the research that we tend to see does tend to focus on ASX companies. And so there's just a little bit of a gap in the literature as a result.
Thank you. That is a beautiful segue to my final question. This panel is racing by. Jennifer, with AirTrunk being investor-owned by Blackstone and CPPIB, do you have any insights you can share with us on what their level of interest has been with your report and how they are or will use the information?
Sure, and I'm happy to share that perspective. So AirTrunk is owned by Blackstone and CPPIB, and both investors take sustainability and climate risk seriously. They have been closely engaged with us, not just on disclosure, but on understanding how climate and transition risk show up for a business like us operating across Asia Pacific. And what this report gives them is decision useful information. It helps them see at a portfolio level where physical risk vary across markets, how regulatory and policy setting may shift, and what the long-term implications are for the resilience of the assets they own. So for the investor of their scale, climate risk is fundamentally an investment risk question. How do temperature trends, water availability and policy changes translate into long-term value, risk mitigation, and capital allocation? So our S2 report gives them a structured, data-led way to assess that. And it aligns with their broader belief that integrating sustainability into investment decisions strengthens performance over time. So this work doesn't sit on the side. It really fits directly into how they think about risk, opportunity, and long-term stewardship of the portfolio. And the clarity that came out of the whole process is something that they genuinely value.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that beautiful closing reflection. Please join me in thanking our panelists for that conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hang Chen, Assistant Manager from AASB. It's my absolutely great pleasure to welcome you all to the very first research session of today. So we will kick off the session with a presentation delivered by Professor Roger Simnett. Roger is a professorial research fellow at Deakin University and an emeritus professor at the University of New South Wales. Previously, he served as the chair of the AASB and a member of International Auditing and Assurance Standard Board. Roger is widely recognized for his 25 years of experience in audit standard setting and also his extensive publication in the field. Please join me in welcoming Professor Roger.
Thank you, Hung. It's a pleasure to be here. Gee, it's been a jam-packed morning of information, hasn't it? So very much enjoyed it. And the lessons continue to build off each other, I hope. We're concentrating on preparedness, and so identifying how well prepared Australian companies are for the S2. So this is really to inform basically the standard setting bodies as to what issues we're trying to see, and the regulatory bodies such as ASIC and Australian Treasury have paid some attention to this particular area. Doesn't really build off research, although what I'm doing is building up an archival research base, or the team's building up an archival research base where we can look at later some of the associated with some of the better disclosure practices. So my views are informed by effectively what we've done is AASB, AASB research reports now over a 7 or 8 year period. And it's concentrating on ASX companies, all ASX we've looked at that we possibly can in those particular areas as to how much climate related information is going into annual reports. So we'll look at those. Undertaking some contract research for the AASB, looking to see what other types of schemes other than S2 companies are reporting under, and what are the implications for S2 of those particular areas. We have a questionnaire which has just been sent out to a number of preparers and a number of assurance providers, looking at preparedness for Group 2 and Group 3 entities and trying to get some insights. It's just been sent out, and I'll give you some very brief introductions and encourage everybody to actually do that questionnaire. We need some help. The response has been pretty good from the assurance providers, from the preparers. We'd love to get some great further insights and some academic research. So these are the joint research reports. They are published on the AASB, AUASB websites. They go over it and they really give us a longitudinal analysis of companies from a perspective of what they've been putting on climate-related information into their annual reports. So we'll look at those particular areas and we'll identify the types of trends. We look at nearly every ASX company that we can. So there are some ASX companies that actually put in reports that are not machine readable. So some of the sessions that we had yesterday on going to putting in machine readable form is there. We looked at it from periods reporting 2018 to 2024, which took us up to basically 2025. We've looked at everything within the annual report, plus we've looked at any sort of statements of corporate governance. First stage did not include standalone sustainability reports, and we'll talk a little bit about that as to what we see. And they were the keywords that we used. ASIC has done some similar work, and they've used a fairly similar list of keywords, so some slight changes there. So what do we see as a trend? Well, the trend is that there is a whole lot more climate-related information going in there, which is an indication of preparedness, not for S2, but at least there's a consideration of climate-related information. So we're at the stage there in 2024, and that's only to 30th of June reporters. That's why the numbers are slightly lower there, where 2/3 of Australian entities are now talking about climate-related information in their annual report. So that's a huge jump on what we've seen before. Now, over 90% of Group 1 entities were included in that particular group, but it also builds up in some of the areas. The alignment with S2 disclosures, so a broad alignment with S2 disclosures, increases over time, 2024, about 1/4. So that's the number that are disclosing in the annual report. Nearly everybody is everybody who is disclosing in the annual report is disclosing outside the financial statements. So the discussion's going outside the financial statements. The amount of discussion that's going into the financial statements on climate-related information is increasing exponentially to nearly 1/4 in 2024. And I've got an audit issue there, which is whether the auditors are actually referring to this information in their audit report. That is increasing from a very low base. What about broader implications? So the implications for broader sustainability reporting, we've found very few instances of broader sustainability reporting. If we look at that, which don't mention climate. So just everybody who does a sustainability report, just about everybody who does a sustainability report includes climate, which means that we're going to pick up most of our areas through our keyword search in those particular areas of broader, if this information's in broader sustainability. But if we also look at, we try to break this down, we've looked at this from organisations that have quantified Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and some of the databases we've looked at. And interestingly, a lot of organisations that are quantifying Scope 1 and Scope 2 from some of those databases, and they include CDP, Refinitiv types of databases, are not actually disclosing that information in the annual report. So there's a lot of detailed information which is not getting picked up into the annual report. So you'd have to be very careful of that. A lot of that is NGES requires, which don't actually disclose it. They disclose it in a separate report, but then they don't actually include a lot of that information into their annual report. And some sort of organisations are disclosing to CDP database there a questionnaire, which is probably after they've done their annual report. So those areas. So you'd have to be a little bit careful about detailed disclosures for preparedness. If we broke that down into Group 1 and Group 3, so as far as disclosures, you can see the disclosure mean there, 74.3, that's over our population of 2018 to 2025. And obviously at the end, it's over 90%, but it falls off a cliff. So Group 2 and Group 3 are just not disclosing a heck of a lot of information in their annual reports, telling us something about preparedness of those areas. We then went on to look at whether or not the reporting, what other reporting frameworks are companies referring to. And so again, we've just given this to the AASB in 2025. These are the reporting frameworks referred to. TCFD is the major reporting framework referred to. Doesn't mean they're implementing CCFD. In a lot of cases, they will not use the words implemented in accordance with. They'll use words like informed by TCFD. But 231 Australian entities, at least that's I expected that to be a good roadmap into S2. SDGs they refer to as a reporting framework on sustainability. It's very principle-based, and so doesn't really give a lot of guidance as to what you do. GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, with a broader sustainability focus is obviously there, and going down to the GHG protocol, and then NGES, nearly 100 companies in those particular areas. So the key takeaways for this was that there was limited barriers to S2 from other reporting frameworks. There was a concern as to whether an organisation was reporting under it. Most of those frameworks were voluntary in those particular regards. GRI, for example, has been picked up voluntarily in Australia in those regards. The major ones that their TCFD was subsumed by S2, so that's fine. GRI areas, and so the major areas we said for voluntary was that there should be a coordination, and we have seen coordination with between the IFRS Foundation and GRI and the IS Foundation and some of the initiatives that are happening in Europe, corporate reporting, sustainability reporting dialogue in those particular areas. The major area of concern was in NGES reporting, which had different measurement methodologies associated with it, and AASB has picked that up by the fact that it allows the NGES reporters to use those types of methodologies, so there's not a conflict there. And as Tom referred to earlier, that's been picked up internationally as well. Current state of play on sustainability reporting from IFAC report, which look at many different countries. So they look at, in Australia, they look at the largest 50 and nearly 50 ASX companies. The major takeaway from this is that the big fall off in separate sustainability reporting. So companies are putting this stuff into annual reports. So it's been put in there in the area. You can see that in their latest report, 6% were disclosed in sustainability report compared to 72% This is ASX 50, so this is really the top end, ASX 50 in 2019. So the major area is this is all coming together in one report as is part of the area of brief. So the stage two, what I call stage two, because stage one for the AASB and AUASB was to actually give them the snapshot of 2024 reporters in those particular areas. So this research is being supported by AASB, AUASB, and Chartered Accountants ANZ in order to undertake an implementation readiness snapshot. So this is the questionnaires that have gone out to reporting entities and to assurance providers. And so our work to date suggests that Group 1 listed entities are reasonably prepared. They're not as well prepared as I expected, which was a little bit of a surprise. But preparedness is still falling off a cliff for Group 2 and Group 3. So we still have a real issue now. Yeah, so AirTrunk, I think, it's a great best practice example, but it's an outlier in those particular areas. So we're undertaking a survey of all entities that we identify potentially impacted by reporting entities. And most of these, as we've talked about before, are outside the ASX. Most of them are private entities or certainly a lot of overseas subsidiaries coming in those particular areas, which surprised us by the amount, even coming under Group 1 of those particular areas. We've also identified 400 assurance provider firms, over 400 assurance provider firms that have entities. So our numbers are a little bit lower than Treasury's estimates. We estimate we're picking up over 80% of the clients that were sent out, out of the ones impacted, which are being sent out by the areas. 430 assurance firms really worries me because if you have a look at 430 assurance firms, once you drop outside the top 50 assurance firms, they're very much getting down into a smaller regional practitioner base, and you look through their profile and there is not much sustainability expertise associated with those firms, but they may be associated with having to sign off. So that was sent out on Wednesday. As I said, the responses have been pretty good from the audit firms. The responses have not been so good from the reporting entities. So please, reporting entities, please respond. We need the information. Surprising results. So this is to me, and it may not be surprising to everybody else. So the surprising result that I'm hearing from Group 1 is the amount of work this is taking. And I was expecting that if a company was reporting in accordance with TCFD, that the work would be significantly less. There's still a significant amount of work. They still see a significant amount of work, and a lot of organisations have underestimated the amount of work that it takes to adapt what they've reported to the S2 requirements. GRI is another case, and GRI even has more work required. TCFD was probably the one that's surprising me. So for Australian overseas subsidiaries, and again, this is on very low basis of observations, and in some case, one. For overseas subsidiaries of an overseas parent, even if the overseas parent is disclosing climate-related information, that can be very limited in the Australian subsidiary because there's a different entity there. And so they're just finding it's not coming across in those particular areas. So it's the overseas subsidiary that was expecting, because their parent is providing all this, is actually preparing all this information, still a lot of work for overseas subsidiaries. So don't underestimate the effort. As I said, over 400 assurance firms have potential climate-related clients. Over 200 have one client, and over 300 have no apparent. So 350 have no apparent climate-related expertise associated with their audit practitioners. So as to whether or not they don't necessarily have to be signing off, but there's a good chance they will be first point of contact for many of these particular entities as they go forward. The one I skipped over there which, and I'm actually not sure it's allowed, so I should have checked this before it is. Some Group 1 entities are claiming that they have determined that climate-related risks and opportunities are not material to the entity's financial prospects. Now, I don't know whether so it's clear that Group 2 and Group 3 can claim that. It's not clear to me Group 1. I should have asked Adrian or somebody else, or the AASB, as to whether that could be done. The auditors haven't signed off on those. So it's not clear whether the auditors would sign off, but there are some group where their climate-related report is going to be their justification for that, or that's what they're anticipating, that's what they're talking about at the moment. So that may change over time. So that was a surprising one. And there were concerns around the disclosures and a new expectation gap opening up. So I kept on hearing this fairly consistently. And it's really that they have been reporting under a double materiality. They're working back to a financial materiality, an S2, much more financial materiality focus. They are very concerned about whether how the users will be brought along in that particular area. So the potential for around materiality, usually I'm hearing it, and the disclosures that are associated with this and who the intended audience is, I'm hearing the areas of potential there. How entities can better prepare, a few areas here. Understand if the entity is required to report. So for preparers, understand if the entity is required to report and make sure you talk to your auditor. Please finish our questionnaire. Please submit your questionnaire. If required to report for Group 2 and Group 3, set up your governance processes now. Determine your assurance provider and talk to them about it, because that's going to be a major source of evidence. Determine whether climate-related risks and opportunities are material. A lot of organisations are going to be taking that particular path, and so you need to make that determination and talk to your auditor about that or assurance provider about that. Initial assessment, do your gap analysis, identify the appropriate related climate metrics, targets, systems and technology, and for disclosures, quality, specificity, and connectedness is more important than quantity. Easy to put a heck of a lot of stuff out there, but it's not easy. But it has to be high quality, as we've heard consistently. Lots of resource hubs. AASB, fantastic. I mean, it is really good. It's very comprehensive. ASIC as well. Oh, gee, I'm ticking off all the boxes out here for the front row. AIC Director's Guide, looking a little bit dated, and professional bodies and accounting firms as well. For the researchers in the room, we've heard it all the time, we need evidence-informed policy setting. Academics are the only ones who are appropriately trained to do this. They're independent, they have no areas, and they're trained to provide evidence. So we are doing this. We keep on hearing of everybody else doing it. They're either not necessarily trained, or they're pushing a particular view. Entities will adapt their disclosure requirements, and we need to know how as a result. For reports in the annual report, the concern around siloed, how that connectivity works is an area that I'm interested in, and the new impact of new information on report users. So thank you. And it is a very new, brave world that we are facing.
Thank you, Roger. Before I introduce each panelist coming to the stage, I just want to remind that what our panel members know are some of the themes and the questions that we discussed during the pre-panel meeting, but what they really don't know are the questions coming from you, our audiences. So please don't forget to scan the QR code and submit any of the burning questions that you have for our panels. You have the power to really shape the energies and the dynamics in the discussion in our panel discussion. We're coming in a few seconds. So now I'm so excited to introduce our distinguished panel members who will be joining us on the stage. They will be introduced in the alphabetical order based on last name. Could I please introduce to everyone Claire Labouchadier. Claire, please come up and join us. Claire is a senior executive leader at ASIC. She leads the sustainability financial reporting and auditing team within ASIC regulation and supervision group. Thanks, Claire. Our second panel members, Karen McWilliams, please join us. Karen is a sustainability and business reform leader at CAANZ. In her role, Karen plays a key part in shaping and driving business reform issues that are relevant for the chartered accountants. And last, may I please introduce our panel members, Sean Osborne. Sean leads the accounting policy team at New South Wales Treasury, providing accounting policy and also technical guidance across the New South Wales public sector. Sean is also our current board members. And this session will be moderated by Adrian King, AASB board members and partner of climate change and sustainability at KPMG. Please join me in welcoming Adrian and all panel members.
Excellent. Thank you, Hang. And I get to ask the questions this time. So please do use the app, do ask lots of questions. We'll see them coming up on the screen. And yes, please ask difficult ones. The panel's up for it. So we've just heard from Roger in particular about the preparedness. And so there's two things we're going to very much do in this panel. First of all, get some other perspectives on the preparedness of the Australian market for this new standards coming through. And then we're actually going to pivot to what their expectations are of that information. And so, how's it going to be used? How's it going to be forced? We do have a great range of panelists up here. We have the regulator, we have academia, we have government, and we have private sector and assurers. So we have the whole range of potential preparers, users, and influencers, should we say. So let's start off to really much extend that presentation that Roger's just given us on the preparedness and ask some of the other panel members in particular their views on preparedness. So maybe, I think I might even go in order. So Claire. Claire, we've heard about some of the outreach, some of the surveys, some of the assistance that ASIC are doing. What's your views as the regulator at the moment on how prepared the Australian market is?
Yeah, thank you. So ASIC recently conducted an exercise where we looked at a sample of voluntary climate-related disclosures in the market, and we looked at particularly those who are likely to be caught in Group 1, both listed and unlisted entities. And I have to say our findings were quite similar to Roger's. So we did see quite a stark difference between listeds and unlisted. So on the listed side, we saw quite sophisticated disclosures, particularly at that larger end. We saw Scope 3 disclosures being made, and generally they were based on TCFD framework. And so because AASB S2 is based off the pillars of TCFD, that cohort we expect are more prepared than others, but of course there is still uplift that's required. When it came to unlisteds, we saw very little voluntary disclosures. Now, that's not to say that preparations aren't happening behind the scenes, but it certainly wasn't evident to us from the reviews that we conducted. And when it comes to the disclosures that we did see some areas for improvement, which we've been sharing with the market so they can learn from them when they are doing their mandatory work. A key one was really just about the way the information was presented. So we saw quite a bit of repetition, and some of the key material information about how entities are managing climate risks and opportunities were often obscured. So I think the takeaway is really keep the user at the heart of the way that you're presenting your information. We also saw that it wasn't always obvious the assumptions and methodologies that sat behind some of the disclosures. So when it came to things like scenario analysis, it wasn't always obvious to us how those were how they came together and what they were based on. So there are a couple of things to think about. So our message really is to build on the previous panel discussion to start preparing early, not just group 1, but group 2 and group 3 as well. So start to put in place the organisational and governance structures that you need to think about your risk and opportunities and to think about your reporting obligations. Think about what data you're going to need to collect and how you're going to do that, as well as thinking about the people. So making sure you're upskilling internally and getting the trusted external advice that you need as well. In terms of what ASIC's doing to help entities prepare for reporting, Tom mentioned it earlier, but we are working with the AASB to commission some educational materials. We're hoping those will be available in the near future. And they really are designed to help those who are new to the reporting space to think about and understand some of those foundational elements to the reporting. So understanding climate-related risks and opportunities and helping them understand how they might identify that within the organisation. We've also created a dedicated sustainability webpage, and we've launched a newsletter, a reporting and audit newsletter, which is designed to help people keep up to date with regulatory developments in this space.
Great, thanks, Claire. And so I'll keep going along this line this way. So Karen, professional bodies, obviously CANZ, I'm seeing everywhere, obviously on a number of working groups as well. How are you seeing the preparedness of both the preparers, but also, I guess, the members, the assurers as well?
Yeah, thank you. I feel like probably Claire and I must have planned the same sort of notes because I don't want to totally repeat everything that she just said. I think certainly the challenge of Group 1 and the unlisted is definitely there. Only in the last couple of weeks, I sort of heard from a contact overseas who mentioned that a large multinational had sort of questioned whether they actually had to do something in Australia. Couldn't they just use their CSRD report? And so that it did make me sort of reflect on the fact that I think a lot of the unlisted entities or those sort of subsidiaries of large multinationals who are based here, typically when I think about the governance structure of them, they've often got sort of internal executives. So whereas perhaps in this sort of Australian board community, we're seeing that cross-pollination across boards so that if one finds out about it, they'll pass it on. I just wonder whether in that sort of subsidiaries of multinationals, we don't see that in the same way. And so those messages perhaps aren't getting through the normal channels. And we've probably got to think a little bit smarter about how we raise that awareness. I mean, we're only a few months out and some of them haven't even started. So that's probably a bit of a challenge around that. I think with the groups 2 and group 3, they don't have to be ready now. And I think that's important to note, but they need to be starting now. And so on a recent sort of discussion that we had, it was definitely when asked around what would you, if you could go back in time, what would you do first? The comment was build capacity. So I think we can't underestimate, I know Claire mentioned upskilling. I don't think we can underestimate how important that is. And obviously using those trusted advisors and using consultants, but make sure you embed it into your organization, use them to build the organizational capacity that's not there. And obviously the smaller entities I know don't even have the finances for those kind of external resources. So use what's out there. There's an absolute mountain of freely available content and webinars. I think most of the professional bodies, the large services firms, there is so much out there. ASIC are working on stuff. So, take as much as you can in. But I do appreciate that the smaller entities, the challenges, they're trying to run their business. So where do you find the time for upskilling? And I think the key point has to be you have to find the time. For CANZ, we've been putting out quite a bit. We've got quite a series of information guides that are out there in terms of resources. So that's they're trying to explain some of these key terms because we're conscious that we've got a lot of organisations out there where the executive teams have no idea what a transition plan is or what a scenario analysis is. So we're trying to actually get something that members can share with those teams to actually explain some of those key terms. And the other question I guess we've had particularly coming from members is how do I know if I've done enough? So we've just recently launched a new certificate on climate-related disclosures, and the idea being that it is something that is assessed at the end. So at least you have that a level of knowledge that you can then evidence that you've actually got there. And I think that's the kind of thing that a lot of people are sort of working towards in this space. So those would probably be the key things I'd reflect on in that, and just try and, yeah, start now. You should have started yesterday, and just, I think that is you can't underestimate the work involved, because those large listed companies, as Roger's shown, they were already doing TCFD. So they already had a head start on a lot of the others. And I think that will be the challenge.
And there is so much information out there, free, all the way back to the first presentation of the day, the new National Climate Risk Assessment and all the tools coming off that for physical risk, the sector plans that came out only about 3 months ago for transitional risk, and then how do you put all that into practice? I agree, there's lots. Now, one of the challenges, obviously, is there's lots, but the hub is clearly the place to go to find it all. Now, government. The good news is government, I think, are walking the talk. Well, some are. Sean, how is government prepared? Because obviously the S2 requirements are being implemented by some governments as well.
It's interesting. I mean, some governments have dived in at the entity level, have mandated a framework similar to AASB S2, although we've adapted it. So in terms of readiness, we did a lot of work with government agencies before. And so we and we took a decision we could wait, build the capabilities, and then dive into AASB S2 or IAASB S2 when we were first thinking about it. Or we could get started. We made the decision to get started. So what we did is we provided a whole bunch of exemptions. And, you know, if you look at the New South Wales framework, for example, you can see that AASB S2 is mapped to our framework in the back. So we don't require Scope 3 because that was a particular challenge for the public sector, which is where is the boundary of Scope 3 when you do so many things with so many people in the economy. We gave quite a few exemptions around the requirements for quantitative disclosures and scenario analysis. So a lot of that happened up front. In New South Wales and the Commonwealth dived in head first. New South Wales, we've had our first 29 government agencies have prepared reports for 24-25. We are currently looking at those, so we've only just started to look at that. But I guess some of the initial thoughts that are coming out is that data collection was an issue. So governments have lots of information. We heard someone say yesterday, and there's lots of information on climate, sustainability. It's not always clear whether it's mandatory. It's not always linked to each other. We found challenges in completeness of information, even in finding out what risks and opportunities are. So talking to someone from one of our big departments last week, they talked about 5 weeks of solid interviews just to find out in a sort of a $12-14 billion infrastructure business exactly where the risks and opportunities are. So just 5 weeks of solid interviews. So that they were things we found. I'd agree with Karen on skills. One of the things that we have found is that by going in and phasing it, we have gradually built some skills that wouldn't have been there. I think had we gone big bang, we would have been in real trouble. We've been asking people to do things that they knew nothing about. I think the other big learning is that those of us who designed the framework, so in New South Wales, it was interesting that I'm an accountant, so this stuff is 30%, 20% of my job. And it transpired we already had a team, a sustainability balance sheet team that manages the New South Wales balance sheet. They look at all sustainability things, but they were looking at climate because investors were asking about that. So one of the learnings I had is that you need to talk to, and I'm sure this is the same across all sectors, you really do need to start talking to those people and to engineers and environmentalists and all those sorts of specialists very early on, not just to tell them what you know, what you're going to do, but to actually build the relationship. So, I mean, when I initially spoke to that team, and they vaguely knew who I was. They knew I was this sort of accountancy person on a different floor. When I mentioned the fact that accountants were getting involved in this, it took a few careful discussions over a number of weeks and months to sort of to build that relationship. And in fact, it's worked fantastically, I think, from both sides. So I would say skills and relationships, strangely, were the big learning for us.
Okay. Excellent. So there's some insights on preparedness. Now we're going to pivot towards expectations, I guess, of either the users, preparers, or the first place that I'm sure you're all very interested in is the regulator. How is the regulator going to enforce this? So, Claire, what's your expectations as the regulator?
Yeah, thank you. And I think when we'll be responsible for administering the new sustainability reporting obligations, and our starting point is really, well, what are the objectives here, and what is the regime designed to achieve, which is really about, we've heard it before this morning, high quality, consistent and comparable information about an entity's climate risks and opportunities, so investors and users can make informed decisions and drive capital allocations. And that aligns completely with ASIC's mandate, which is about confident, informed investors and consumers and efficient capital markets. So that's always going to be our starting point. We do recognise that these requirements are new, that they're different, and that it will take time for entities to put in place the arrangements that they need in order to comply. And so you've probably heard our chair and our commissioners talking about the fact that we will be pragmatic and proportionate in the way that we supervise and enforce these new obligations. So we're very much conscious that it is a journey, and that we will be taking that into account in the way that we approach our supervision. So what does that mean? Really, we're only likely to intervene where we see very serious or reckless misconduct, or where entities actually just don't comply and don't prepare a report at all. So I think what you're more likely to see from us in those early days is that we will, if we see something that raises concerns for us, we're more likely to just pick up the phone and to talk to you and to understand where you're coming from. Really, our focus at the moment is about how we can help entities on that journey to implementation. And so we have published some guidance, Reg Guide 280, which explains, who has to report, when they have to report. It covers how we'll approach our relief powers, and it covers some specific content requirements as well. We've also published some frequently asked questions that are directed at sustainability auditors, so it explains some of the Corps Act requirements in relation to sustainability auditing. And I think that the key point to note is that most of our guidance is more focused on the Corporations Act requirements. You've heard this morning, the AASB is producing educational materials, the AASB is producing materials as well. And so really our focus is making sure that we are talking to them regularly behind the scenes, which we do, so that there is sort of a package of materials that is consistent and works together for all of you. Going forward, in terms of our work program, we will start to review the sustainability reports once we see them lodged with us in March and April of next year. So some of you might be familiar with the surveillance that we do looking at financial reports. So this exercise will be based on that, and we will be publicly sharing our observations. And in the early years, our real goal is to shine a light on what we're seeing. So Group 2 and Group 3 can learn from the experiences of Group 1, and together we can help to lift sustainability reporting quality.
Great, thank you. So, Roger, I'm going to turn to you. So this is the whole point of this, as I said earlier, which is all about information to the capital markets, decision useful information. To avoid a correction, I guess, as a result of the absence of information. So from your perspective, how do you think the capital market's going to use, or what do you think their expectations are, I guess, given what you've gone through about preparedness, and what do they want, and are they going to get it?
So we know there's a demand for this information. I mean, that's been the genesis of the whole area. So there's a demand from capital markets and users to build this into the information. The research shows that if that information is supplied and it is reliable and relevant to the information and easily digestible, then that does have an impact. And so we are seeing within the capital markets, and the research has been both on climate-related specific information and on sustainability information in general, that it does result in things like cost of debt, reductions, etc. And so there's a story here for entities that the benefits, this is not a compliance exercise. This is being done. People will use this information and there's benefits flowing back to your organisation. Now, they're the benefits that AASB said are a little bit unobservable at the moment. We have to relate to those particular areas. We know also that where there are surveys of users, such as super funds or whatever, sophisticated or unsophisticated users, then they really do impact this. This information impacts upon their decision-making and investment profile decisions. But it has to be relevant, it has to be reliable, and it has to be in a form which they can understand. One problem of taking that back is a lot of the research that is done there has been unable to distinguish between, because these are the organisations who are doing this under a voluntary, are unable to distinguish whether that's a signalling that these are just good organisations on a governance and a compliance element. And so it will be interesting. There's lots of research opportunities arising as we go into the mandatory setting as well.
Yeah, great. Cool. Big call for extra research and lots of benefits and reductions in cost of capital, reduction in risk, reduction in access to other markets, capital, investors. Gosh, plenty of opportunities for research. Thank you. Now I'm going to go to government. Sean, who is going to use your government reports? And what are they going to do with it?
It's interesting. I mean, in terms of our current reports, it's interesting. I think we did some work a few years ago, and I think based on hits on our websites, and I think most of the hits happened just after year end when our own people start looking at what they did last year. But in truth, actually, the genesis of why government started providing information, I understand, and this predates me, is investors. So holders of our bonds, initially sustainable bonds, but actually all of our bonds started demanding information, which is why when I had that conversation, they were actually quite receptive to it. What we've learned through the process, of course, is that there are other people that are interested. So there's been some legal cases, people interested, but again, related to bonds. But I think also, citizens and parliamentarians are interested in the financial sustainability as it pertains to climate. So what will happen to my taxes? Will you still be in a position to provide these services that you provide now? Will you be able to provide services to assist flood-assisted regions if there are more floods? So I think there are users. The big question for government, and this is just my personal view, is when and how do we step out of reporting about the impact on ourselves to reporting on the impact that our government policies, government regulation has on households, businesses, the environment. And I think for me, the challenge is, do we try, given the resource cost of doing what we're doing now, just to do 29, in New South Wales, 29, sort of not quite AASB S2 has been a massive resource cost. How much time should we spend on designing and then complying with the framework that reports on our outward impact? Is it even possible? Is it containable in terms of the boundaries, and is it auditable? Or is there another way of reporting that information? Does it belong within something like an S2, or does it actually belong somewhere else? Because, and again, just my personal view, you can get all this reporting perfect, but in the meantime, the world gets warmer. And I do wonder whether we actually get it all perfect when it's too late.
So very similar users, providers of capital, providers of future cash, taxpayers, and services. So yes, users. Thank you. And Karen, what else would you add? A lot of this being covered, but also private sectors and assurers. What do you reckon their expectations are for the next, let's give it 1 to 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, difficult to set their expectations. So I guess what our expectations of the reporting and others is, I think we do expect, I guess, practice in these first couple of years to be quite divergent. I think, and I know, and after lunch, we're going to hear from New Zealand's Financial Markets Authority on the panel. Obviously, New Zealand are a couple of years ahead, but they did do similar reports to ASIC, intentions around what we saw in practice in those New Zealand reports. And I think something that I sort of took away from that was that, yes, there were some who put way too much information in. Some companies didn't put enough. Some was too general. Some was, too detailed, too specific. Information was hidden. So my sense is this first sort of couple of reporting periods, we are going to see quite a broad range of practice. And I think that's okay. That's where ASIC will come in, others will come in, the users will come in, and they'll start to say, this is what we like, this is what we didn't like, and we will see that practice in the reporting converge over time. So I think we shouldn't expect the year 1 reports to look like the year 5 reports. I think we will see a maturity. I think the other thing is that we've talked a lot about the benefits, and I think that's incredibly important to see. I think the first sort of year or 2 of reporting, we said there's a lot of capacity building, processes, controls, getting documentation, just getting everything set up. It's a big sort of blip in the whole thing because we have got to really do all of that initial work. And I think Sean's talked about that initial resourcing. But I think we will see that start to plateau and start to sort of ease over time. And certainly some of the entities in New Zealand certainly saw in their second year of reporting, they started to see those strategic benefits coming through. It wasn't as hard as it was in the first year. And I think we can take those lessons from that experience and sort of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in year 1, kind of go, oh my goodness, this was all too hard. Because once you've done it and you've invested, then it becomes iterative after that. And I think that's something that we do need to expect to see. And everyone's, there's a little bit of patience in a way needed to actually say, yeah, this is going to be hard. And I think someone said on an earlier panel, we're doing it all for the first time at the same time. In fact, it was you, wasn't it? So,
that's right.
And that's, I think, what we're going to see. So that would be sort of my observations, I guess, around that sort of expectation. Let's not expect everything to be perfect year 1, but let's expect to see everyone have a very, very good go at it.
Yep. So there's some questions that we're going to take on the panel on the screen here. Please dive in. I won't initially address you, but to an individual, unless no one says anything, and then I will. So the first one I'm going to take though is it continue in that same theme, which is about comparability. I think. Can you comment on the expectations for comparability between companies? That wasn't helpful. Sorry, it's gone to small font. Comparability between the company's S2 disclosures and the ability to directly assess comparable performance, risks, and opportunities. So again, I mean, this has been brought in from a set of guidance, TCFD guidance, effectively, to a set of standards, which are to achieve consistent, comparable, reliable information for users. But yeah, I guess what the question here is very much about what's the expectation on comparability between these disclosures and maybe even broader disclosures of performance risks and opportunities? Anyone?
Well, let me start, and then Karen was going to jump in. But look, I agree with Karen that in the first couple of years we're going to see a divergence, and I think that's nearly every time you see a new regulation and a disclosure regulation, you see divergence, and then it converges. It converges around best practice, it converges around education, etc. What we know about S2 is that it is designed to basically pick up what we think is the underlying climate-related performance. So it's not a compliance exercise. It's to give the market the evidence they want. So I think that compliance with S2 is going to give the market at once. Now, if we find that's not the case and that will be tested, then we need to reconsider. And so this is a much more adaptive standard than we used to with financial reporting. There's changes coming through, and I think that we can do that pretty well.
And I think it's important to note, I think the comparability that it's seeking to achieve is obviously across entities, but also comparing the same entity over a period of time. And obviously that will only come once we start to see that period of time come through as well.
Yep. A few questions here on just capacity. Maybe I'll take them together. One is, should accounting education prepare students for the future? And then the other side of the same coin, I think the other question I've got up here is about sustainability practitioners basically working with other teams and how much does sustainability practices understand about the accounting profession themselves. So any views on, I mean, I assume the answers are typically yes. Karen, you're, I assume, pushing one in particular.
Yeah, I guess
ensuring one, not pushing it. Sorry,
no.
ensuring one happens.
I guess what we're definitely seeing coming through in practice, and some of the good examples we've seen about how entities are implementing this, is that, and I think Sean's touched on it. It's sort of cross-pollination between the teams. So it's sustainability teams and finance teams. Depending on how organizations are structured, some are taking people from the finance team and putting them in the sustainability team to focus on the reporting. Others are doing it the other way across. So there's definitely that really close connection between those teams. Those who are doing it are doing a multidisciplinary working group that will meet regularly, and that'll include the sustainability and the finance, but legal, risk, and everyone else. So it really is a very sort of, I guess, cross-divisional approach within organizations that I think is the way to do it. It needs to bring everybody in. How can you actually take the different perspectives? Obviously, if you do that, you've got to make sure everyone goes away knowing what they've got to do, and everyone doesn't walk away thinking that they've got nothing to do from each meeting. But I think clear roles and responsibilities come with that. But I think it is bringing all those important perspectives. We certainly think accountants have very transferable skills into this space, and they need to build up that knowledge, whether it be in assurance or in reporting. I think they've definitely got those skills. But likewise, others are bringing very important ones. And do we think accountants are going to be doing all of the preparation, I guess, around the information of measuring Scope 3 emissions or writing the transition plan? Possibly not. It depends on where their skill set is, and we need the right people to come together to actually, I guess, bring this reporting and the assurance to the fore. And Sean, you've probably got your experience as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, following on from what I was saying before, I mean, our sustainability finance team are government policy people and economists, and then they brought climate people in as well, and they drafted our materiality matrix. Now, I was saying yesterday, materiality is accountants' superpower, but we struggle to explain it to other people, and we spent ages on materiality. But in the end, one of the last people into the sustainability team who had a climate background came up with this idea for a matrix and explained it. So yes, to answer the question, yes, the language changes. Our sustainability and our climate people talk about, they talk about materiality. I think the other thing is, to Karen's point, accountants have a good role, and I think we found that those people appreciated and have given us feedback that they've learned how to present information in a dispassionate and balanced way. They got all the information, they know it better than we do, but we were able to help craft them such that it was balanced, auditable, material, or had an eye to materiality, and was auditable. We also, when they started being audited, if you haven't been audited before, it's, what's going on? And so we were able to calm them down and work out, and help them through that process. So yeah, it was as I said before, it was a learning experience for both of us, and the questioner was spot on. Language has changed.
And I don't think we can underestimate how different the language is. Put an economist, an accountant, a lawyer, a sustainability professional in a room, and this might as well go to Europe and talk different languages. Anyway, last question I'm going to take, because I'm getting a 1 minute call, and it's a good one, because it's all about effectively Scope 1 and 2 and carbon accounts. So how confident are you in the quality of businesses' carbon accounts, and how could they be improved? Whilst this is a climate risk standard, there's no doubt many are very focused on the Scope 1 and 2 emissions, because that's probably the first place to go for basic understanding, even though I don't believe it's the main intent. But a lot of conversations are about Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are often called carbon accounts. So yeah, how confident is everybody with their carbon accounts? And that's a challenging, like I say, give that term to an accountant, and it's going to say, what are you on about?
I was quite lucky, because we've got an organisation called Department of Climate Change, Environment and Water. So they sort of did all of that and explained, how that should be done. And there was sort of a centralised approach. And I think the Commonwealth government have taken a similar approach to sort of centralising a lot of that, which helped agencies. So I don't know how confident I am, but I'm pretty confident it's consistent. Everyone's done it the same way.
Yeah. And NGAS is great, let's be honest. Globally, NGAS has got to be one of the best footprinting stocktake tools and enforcement. It's been around 15 years. 15, 17 years. So hopefully we know what we're doing by now.
And I think I think those, and NGAS captures the largest sort of scope 1 and 2 kind of emissions across Australia outside of agriculture.
Yeah.
So I think, for that, can we be reasonably comfortable in that quality? Yes. And probably that means if you're not part of NGAS because you don't meet the thresholds, not because you haven't read the thresholds recently, but if you're not part of it because you actually genuinely don't, then I think we can be pretty comfortable that we've got the biggest ones of those. There's some work out now, DQ, Commonwealth DQs, are putting out a consultation on greenhouse gas emissions for the agriculture space and looking at some standardization of measurement there, because that is a big gap. So that's probably where my concern sits, in that scope 1 space, that is a gap in Australia. It's quite a significant component of our scope 1 emissions. So we do need to improve the measurement there. So I think hopefully those guidelines will help to standardize that a little bit better. And then scope 3 really depends on sort of how entities measure it. But realistically, we've got the scope 1 information in Australia that's pretty good. Obviously, there will be some scope 3 that will be related to scope 1 elsewhere around the world. But I think it does give us a very good base.
Yep. Excellent. So ag is definitely a challenge. LULUCF, as it's called globally, on a COP, if you're watching COP at the moment. Okay, so some key points there. Very much about preparedness and expectations. If anyone is listening that needs to know what to do, focus on governance and risk structures early, think about data, and find the experience within the organization. Upskill yourselves, especially if you're a group 2 or group 3, and get advice if you need it. And the key message, start early if you haven't already. So can you, a couple of things. You are going straight to lunch, which is straight outside after I literally say close. But before we do that, could we just thank the panel for a great session? Thank you very much. So, as I say, lunch is literally directly behind, and you've got to be back at 1:30. Is that correct? Yes, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.